So welcome everyone to day 2 of the AIOH 2020 Virtual Symposium. My name is Peter Aspinall and I am today's MC for the sessions. To make this more engaging, this event, please log into the chat and be part of the conversation. Enter your full name, tick on the little accept terms of conditions button and press join. The session presenters today will be online for their sessions, so please post any questions to them when you get them during the session. Normally at this time of the year, we'd be crowding into various conference rooms looking for someone interesting to sit next to or looking for someone to avoid. I don't know about you, but it feels a bit weird starting conference proceedings at this time of the afternoon. I guess for some of you, it might actually feel a bit normal starting time, just without the hangover after Monday night's traditional 3 a.m. night. We all know who you are. Handy hint for the day, I'm going to try and teach you to be super IT savvy. If you hold down the control key, when you click on one of the other buttons just up here, it will open a new window and you can browse away and still hear the audio, me, and the presenters during the day. Some of you have seen the trivia questions yesterday. Make sure that you check out the trivia tab up here also. And participate in the daily quizzes to possibly win a free registration to the upcoming masterclasses. If you don't know an answer, make something up. It gives everyone, particularly the committee, something to work away on in the background and gives us a bit of a laugh. Normally, I would be encouraging you to attend the exhibitors trade displays and see what bag stuffers you can get and take home for the office or the kids at home. But this year we've got the sponsors and exhibit pages also up here. Lots of topical information, latest products and services, and if you look closely, there's a few downloads and options and fact sheets and some special freebies. So now is your last chance to run away and quickly grab a drink, but you need to settle in with maybe some snacks, and we're going to kick off day 2. Depending on the feedback I'm about to get from the awesome team of Samira and Kelly Johnson and the rest of the committee, I will be joining you throughout the afternoon. But let's get the sessions underway.
I was fortunate enough to attend the 2019 conference in Perth and sit for my AIOH exam. I remember sitting outside a CES session during morning tea a couple of hours before my exam, and I was nervous, like really nervous. I was chatting with a few CIOH people that I'd seen around the traps a couple of times, and they only had a short conversation with me, but they really did talk me off that ledge and give me the confidence I needed to get through the exam. They probably don't even remember the conversation or realise how much it helped, but it's definitely something that'll stick with me for a long time.
It was when I presented at the 2013 Sydney AIOH conference.
Well, I would say probably 2 things: the conferences and the company, and of course the papers that were presented, the chance to network, the chance to ask people questions. It was great. It was just terrific.
My best memory is probably winning the Drager Young Hygienist Award. It's an experience I'll forever be grateful for, and it really kick-started my career and my belief in myself.
Would be every Sunday evening before the conference kicks off, where I get to catch up with friends and colleagues that I may have not seen for the past year.
The Melbourne conference I've attended in 2018. Being the first AIOH conference I've attended, I was very impressed with the quality of the presenters, the networking opportunities and the fun time I've had.
Well, 3 things stand out for me. Firstly, winning the Bilsam Award many years ago enabled me to travel to Europe and the US, and that was a marvellous experience for me and great for my personal development. The second thing was being part of the council structure for the Institute, including a year as president in 2012. That was, again, a great opportunity and one that I very much value. And the third thing that's happened along the way is I was greatly honoured last year to have received the Pam de Silva Award or Medal. That was definitely a career highlight for me, so I very much appreciate that coming from my peer group.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Graham Powell from Safety Equipment Australia, and we're proud to be a gold sponsor for this year's conference, and a fitting time when the AIOH is celebrating their 40th year. Safety Equipment Australia has been a sponsor of the keynote overseas speaker since 1988. So that's 32 years now, and we're very proud of that, and we look forward to continuing that well into the future. And now it is our pleasure to introduce to you the next keynote overseas speaker, Dr. Lisa Brousseau.
Thank you to AIOH for the invitation to speak today about COVID-19 aerosol transmission. I'm first going to discuss the data that support the biological plausibility of aerosol transmission for SARS-CoV-2, and then I'll talk a little bit about what aerosol transmission means in the context of workplace health and safety. As most of you are probably aware, people generate particles over a wide range of particle sizes, from less than 1 micron to well above 100 microns. Breathing generates particles mostly around 1 micrometer, which you can see on the left-hand side here, with a range of about 1.1 to 10 micrometers. Most of these will remain airborne and will be transported throughout a space. Speaking, coughing, sneezing generate a second mode of aerosols that center at around 100 microns, in addition to that smaller mode at around 1 micron. The larger droplets will settle quickly, while the smaller particles will remain airborne. The classic infection control paradigm is based on data and studies that are now more than 70 years out of date and do not reflect our current understanding of the creation, behavior, or inhalation of aerosols, which are defined as particles, simply defined as particles suspended in air. Dr. Rachel Jones at the University of Utah and I worked with a graphic artist to describe in relatively simple terms what happens over time to a human-generated aerosol. So as just described, when an aerosol is generated by a human, it contains a range of sizes, both large and small. That we tried to illustrate that in this slide with the different colors and sizes of particles. Someone standing nearby may experience a small amount of droplet spray transmission, meaning propulsion of particles into their face, but will also be surrounded by many small particles that are inhalable. Most of the particles in this aerosol will not fall immediately to the ground. The larger ones can remain suspended for several minutes and the smaller ones for many minutes and hours. Evaporation, especially of the larger ones, will occur, which decreases the overall size distribution of the aerosol. After some time, some of the larger particles will settle, as you can see in this visual, and the smaller ones will begin to disperse. The person close to the source will continue to be exposed to those smaller inhalable particles. If the virus remains viable in air, which is true in the case for COVID-19 virus, and the dose received elicits infection, then disease could commence. And as you can see, the person farther away from the source has no exposure at this point. But with more time, many of the larger particles will have deposited, while the smaller ones will have dispersed throughout the space. I should note that these figures assume negligible air currents in the room, what aerosol scientists refer to as still air. With air currents, there will be more and quicker dispersion of all the particles throughout the room. In this figure, we show that the small particles have been dispersed into the area of person C, who is now at risk of infection from inhalation. Again, if the organism has remained viable and an infectious dose is received. Thus, Dr. Jones and I proposed a new infection control paradigm that includes inhalation of aerosols at close range, in addition to the traditional droplet and airborne transmission of particles. It should be noted that if airborne transmission is possible, by that I mean inhalation of small particles at far range, then aerosol transmission is also possible. That is, if an organism remains viable long enough to cause infection at a distance, then the organism will be viable also at a close range. So contrary to this traditional droplet airborne dichotomy, small particles can be generated by a source, can remain suspended in the air near that source, and will be inhaled by someone located near the source within 3 to 6 feet. To establish biological plausibility for aerosol transmission, we need to satisfy 3 conditions. First, we have to demonstrate that aerosols can be generated at the source, in this case, an infectious person. Second, we have to show that the organism remains viable in air along the path from the source to the receptor. And third, those inhaled or impacted aerosol particles must be able to access cellular receptors. Dr. Rachel Jones and I wrote a paper referenced in the next slide in 2015 describing these criteria in some detail. I will highlight our key points and apply our approach to SARS-CoV-2. So here are demonstrated in this table the criteria we established that would represent weak, moderate, and strong evidence for each of the 3 criteria I just outlined. For example, finding the organism in body fluids would provide weak evidence for aerosol generation, demonstrating that there are symptoms or aerosol generating procedures, for example, or detecting the aerosol from particles emitted by animals would be moderate evidence, and strong evidence would be that we could detect the organism in aerosols generated by a patient. In this presentation, I don't have time to go through all of these in great detail, but I will briefly outline the evidence that we do have that supports all of these 3 criteria. Viable SARS-CoV-2 has been found in respiratory fluids, including saliva and nasal and oropharyngeal samples, up to 8 days after symptom onset. Viable virus has been found in air samples taken in patient rooms, and viral RNA, but not yet viable virus, has been measured in exhaled breath samples from COVID-19 patients. The organism has a half-life of 2 to 3 hours in experimental aerosols, and epidemiologic data demonstrates person-to-person transmission, especially in clusters, where contact and droplet contact are unlikely or do not account for the degree of transmission, especially from pre- or asymptomatic people. Finally, the ACE2 receptor for SARS-CoV-2 is found throughout the respiratory system. Aerosol transmission has been demonstrated in several animal species, including hamsters, ferrets, and transgenic mice. So the only data we lack are those that demonstrate experimental infection in humans, which would of course be unethical for an organism with no established treatments and potentially serious health outcomes. We proposed a scheme that would assign a point for each degree of evidence, with the maximum strength receiving a total of 9 points. The weight of evidence for SARS-CoV-2 is 8 out of 9, indicating that aerosol transmission should be of high concern, equivalent to the evidence we currently have for tuberculosis, a well-known aerosol transmissible disease. While there has been some attention to workplaces, I think there's been little recognition of the important role that the workplace plays in disease transmission. And not just healthcare settings, as I've illustrated here. The risk factors for outbreaks at work are similar to those for non-work related clusters. Indoors and enclosed spaces, low ventilation, lots of people, and long periods of time. I've been encouraging occupational hygienists to think about exposure from the perspective of source, pathway, and receptor controls. For example, as shown in this photo of a call center, a single individual is a source of infectious aerosols generated during talking. Aerosol concentrations are initially highest near the source, of course, but eventually, with time, the aerosol is dispersed throughout the room. And receptors, or coworkers in this situation, near the source are at greatest risk, but eventually everyone in the space is at some risk of infection. In the context of source control, the best options are those that remove or limit the number of sources by screening, testing, or changing the work to be remote if possible. Screening may not be effective at identifying pre- and asymptomatic individuals, however. Changing the number of people in a room or the length of time spent there also lowers the likelihood of high infectious aerosol concentrations. Because exposure is a function of both concentration and time, anything that limits either of these might be considered a source control. I'm often asked why I don't list face coverings as a source control, and my answer is that these are both unpredictable and generally ineffective at lowering the emission of small particles. Their role in lowering concentration may be limited to very short time periods, and thus have no role where employees spend long periods of time in contact with coworkers or the public. Pathway controls are those that interrupt the pathway from source to receptor. They should be used only after source controls have been implemented. Distance may play some role as a pathway control, keeping in mind, however, that coughs and sneezes can propel particles well beyond standard 3 to 6 feet, and the particles disperse throughout a space over time. There have been numerous recommendations for improving general dilution ventilation in spaces, but we should keep in mind that this has been designed for the purpose of comfort, temperature, and carbon dioxide control, usually, but not for the removal of infectious particles. A general heating, ventilating, air conditioning system seeks to mix the air, which disperses air contaminants throughout a space and may put everyone at risk of exposure. Certainly, increasing the number of air changes per hour can be effective in moving air contaminants out of a space more quickly, but many spaces are not well designed to ensure that complete mixing and efficient removal will occur. In these cases, local exhaust ventilation in the form of a stationary or a portable air cleaner equipped with a high-efficiency filter might be needed to ensure adequate mixing and removal of infectious aerosols. and it may be necessary to use a combination of pathway controls to lower exposures and the risk of infection. At the bottom of the hierarchy, of course, are receptor controls, which should only be used when source and pathway controls are not adequate. Placing the employee in an entirely enclosed, separately ventilated space, such as in a bus or a taxi, as illustrated here, are an example of receptor control, but the more common type of receptor control is the use of personal protective equipment, such as respirators. Surgical masks and face coverings do not offer the level of personal protection needed for an aerosol as hazardous as SARS-CoV-2. Let me expand for just a moment on the issue of face coverings, surgical masks versus respirators. Starting at the right hand of the slide with what we know, respirators have highly efficient filters and if fit tested can achieve a high degree of fit. Thus, respirators can offer both excellent source control as personal protection. Surgical masks, on the other hand, have unpredictable and usually less effective filter performance and are not designed to fit. A study of fit on surgical masks with pretty good filters, not equivalent, however, to respirator filters, found fit factors ranging from 4 to 6, with much less than the 100 expected of a half-face piece air purifying respirator. Surgical masks might provide source control for patients in healthcare settings, but have no place as a form of worker protection. And finally, cloth face coverings have very inefficient filters and are very difficult to achieve any level of fit. Videos of face coverings show lots of leakage all around the face piece. These might offer some degree of source control for large particles when worn by the public, but they should not be required of workers who have contact with co-workers or members of the public. Infection status is unknown. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share these data with you about aerosol transmission and my thoughts on the implications of aerosol transmission for employee protection.
So, thank you, Lisa. It's such a topical presentation. I can't imagine there's been too many people introducing themselves as hygienists in 2020 that haven't been asked for an opinion about transition modes for COVID. So, yeah, I think that's really important. It would have been nice to have this probably at the start of the year. But yeah, that's great. Thank you. Look, we've had a few questions. One at the moment's got probably the most popular vote is something that we've all seen around the place is the small perspex screens. So they're becoming popular to protect the checkout staff and from customers. Is there much evidence for their effectiveness?
So you're talking about, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I think you're talking about what we often refer to in the US as barriers, and there are lots of them everywhere. I saw recently they built big barriers all around each member of a jury in a courtroom. The problem that I see with those is that they might be good if you're worried about coughing or sneezing, and so they might stop large droplets from being sprayed outward, but I don't think they're going to do much good for the smaller particles I talked about in the presentation. Those will just get dispersed and float around. And I've suggested to occupational hygienists a good way to demonstrate their lack of performance would be to use something like a smoke tube or even a bubble, something that generates bubbles, or something that you can demonstrate what really will happen once you create a particle, an aerosol. So I don't recommend them much. I think we have to do something better than that.
Now, we saw them up front and center in your presidential, the vice presidential debates. It were quite interesting to see how that was brought in at that attention, that extra detail for that debate. One of the other big questions that's come about has the effect of temperature and low temperatures, particularly on the risk for transmission. And your thoughts on that?
Yeah. It is true that temperature and relative humidity seem to play a role for some viruses, some respiratory viruses, influenza, for example. And it is hypothesized that might be why influenza is seasonal. I've asked, this is not an area of particular expertise, but I have asked aerosol scientists and virologists what they think. And most of them think that given how naive we are in general to this particular virus, the role of temperature or relative humidity is going to be small, given pretty much anyone can be infected. Eventually, if this virus becomes, seasonal, which it could, just as most influenza strains eventually become seasonal, it then might play a bigger role. But right now, and you can see that, this has become a pandemic throughout the world, and season and longitude and latitude seem to be playing very little role in whether it's transmissible.
Okay, so then in that case, what do you see is probably the most simplest thing to reduce aerosol concentrations in the indoor environment?
I wish it were a simple thing. I think there is a place for respirators in some settings. Certainly in healthcare, there's a place, and in the U.S. there hasn't been as much. There have been supply issues, but there hasn't been as much attention to the use of different kinds of respirators. And I've been pushing the use of elastomeric respirators, which would free up the supply of filtering face piece respirators for more workers. I think there's a role for local exhaust ventilation. And I talked about the portable air cleaners, for example. I've made lots of recommendations to people who are worried about offices or smaller spaces or just the area around a worker, thinking about improving the ventilation in that space for somebody. Now, portable air cleaners, they cost a few $100s in the United States, but they don't clean a huge, gigantic space. So an industrial location is a little more complicated. And I think there you have to do a combination of things. You have to minimize the number of people. You might have to do some testing to be sure that you're screening people who are in the workplace. And you might have to worry about ventilation in combination with distance. So it's like I said, I think we have to think creatively and use a combination of the types of controls that we usually use in industrial settings to control hazardous aerosols, for example.
So just on that comment about the number or the occupancy in a square meterage, have you got some sort of generic guidance around that as to how much, how big, where that's come from?
Yeah. I don't have generic guidance. The problem we have is, first of all, we don't know the infectious dose, although we suspect it's low. There's a recent hamster study that suggests it's as low as maybe 5 to 10 virions. That's a pretty low infectious dose. But the other piece is we don't know how many virions do we actually emit when we breathe. We know how many particles, but we don't know how many virions or virus particles there are and whether they're even viable. So if I knew those things, I could calculate, right? We all could do that. We could calculate a generation rate. We could calculate
exposure standard.
We could put it in our basic exposure assessment modeling equations. We could use those equations, though, with good guesses as a way of illustrating what happens when you, for example, if you improve the air exchange rate. So if you go from 2 air changes per hour to 6 air changes per hour, what happens to the concentration inside a room? We can illustrate that, even if we don't know exactly what that concentration is. We can illustrate what happens when you have more people in a room generating than fewer people. So, all of those are things I've been suggesting to people. I can do a time to infectious dose calculation if I make some assumptions about emission rates.
Yep.
And then I can illustrate the impact of wearing a face covering versus a respirator. So I think that's what we have to do more of, is using our knowledge, not getting bogged down in the fact that we don't have the answers exactly. We actually have the skills and the expertise, and we have a way of illustrating how controls will work, even if we can't be precise about them.
I think that's probably something that's caused problems, is people wanted to be precise and want to have an exact answer, but it's just not, I guess, possible, or to be honest, it needs to be more practical in approaches. Look, we've got heaps more questions. There's a lot of questions. So thank you so much for the presentation. I think we can probably sneak one more in before I get into trouble. The top rating question at the moment is from Terry Gorman. So why has the medical profession been so slow to approach these issues that have been well known by hygienists traditionally?
Yeah, well, there's a question I've asked my whole career, and I don't yet have an answer to. Part of it, I think, is that it's a scary idea, aerosol transmission. And as a physician, you're already putting yourself at some risk, even in your job in general. To add an aerosol exposure to that it makes the world feel more unsafe, shall we say. The other piece is that I think physicians are taught to have the answers to everything, and which is good. We want them to, diagnose problems and figure out what's wrong with us. But they have a tendency to overstep, I think, in that, and I call it epistemic trespassing. They have a tendency to tell you they know the answer to something when they don't. And I think actually industrial hygienists are pretty good at saying, actually, we don't really know the answer, but we will try to figure it out. I wish that infection control practitioners would do a little bit more of that. I wish they would say, let me just read a little more about that. Let me find out the data before they tell you I'm absolutely certain there's no aerosol transmission. So there's my answer.
I am really happy to hear you say that. I know there's a lot of people in the industrial hygiene and occupational hygiene world that are jumping up and down at the moment going, yes, everything that you've just said. Lisa, thank you so much once again for participating and contributing to the virtual symposium. It's been amazing. We really, really enjoyed that. We'd love to have you here in person again sometime soon. So hopefully we can get on top of it and catch up in person.
That would be nice. Thank you. Thanks to all.
Thanks again. Wow, that's a good start. So in keeping with the theme, our next session we're going to move straight on to is risk perception on COVID-19 in Indonesia this time, particularly during the first stages of the pandemic. The presenter is Mila Tejama, so apologies if I get that name wrong, but she's a lecturer with the University of Indonesia. And as a reminder, please keep those questions coming. For this session, Mila will be responding to those questions as they're coming through. So please get them in as you get them. We'll see you on the other side.
Hello everyone, my name is Mila Tejamaya. I am lecturer at Occupational Health and Safety Department, Faculty of Public Health, Universitas Indonesia. On behalf of our team, I would like to say a huge thank you for giving us the opportunity to present our study in risk perception of COVID-19 in Indonesia during the first stage of pandemic. This study is a collaboration study between Universitas Indonesia, Udayana University, Diponegoro University, and Hasanuddin University. My presentation will be divided into 5 parts, as you can see on the screen. As we are all probably aware that we are now facing a global pandemic that requires people to change their behavior by adopting a new normal. According to the health belief model, a people's motivation to adopt health behavior is greatly influenced by their perception regarding the matter. Accurate public perception is very critical in managing public health risk. Therefore, it is important, especially for the government, to examine people's risk perception and people's belief of the extent of the threat and expectation. Before COVID-19, there haven't been many studies regarding risk perception of pandemic issues as compared to environmental risk, for example. But now we are lucky enough to have several studies on people's perception on the pandemic, as you can see on the screen. About COVID-19 in Indonesia, the first and second cases of COVID-19 were officially declared by President Joko Widodo on the 2nd of March 2020. Since then, a website called covid19.go.id has been established by the government as a platform for risk communication. Risk communication mostly cover warning, emergency about the statistic of COVID-19 in Indonesia, as well as triggering behavioral changes. Main control measures that were recommended by governments were hand sanitizing and staying at home. On the second week of May 2020, we did our study to look at the risk perception of Indonesian citizens in terms of COVID-19 pandemic. Up to May 2020, the most affected provinces by the COVID-19 pandemic were Jakarta, West Java, Central Java, East Java, Bali, Banten, and South Sulawesi or Makassar. Therefore, our study was actually focused on the 7 most affected provinces. We would like to describe the level of knowledge of COVID-19 among Indonesian population, and then source of information that the most accessed by the population, risk perception of COVID-19, risk tolerance of COVID-19, level of anxiety, and also differences in prevalence of perception associated with socio-demographic variables. We did our study by using online survey distributed via WhatsApp, Facebook, and LinkedIn of the investigator. A standard questionnaire on risk perception of an infectious disease outbreak from ICOM was adopted. In this study, we look at several variables divided into independent and dependent variables. In general, we would like to look at the risk perception that consists of newness, threat, severity, infectiousness, contagiousness, total cases, and susceptibility of COVID-19, compared to risk tolerance, which consists of perception on the efficacy and self-efficacy, intention to carry out measures, motivation, and hindering factors in the implementation of control measures. We also would like to look at the interaction between risk perception and risk tolerance to actually influence into the extent of anxiety among Indonesian population due to COVID-19. Let me share the result of our study. A total of 1,043 respondents participated in this study from 30 out of 34 provinces in Indonesia. About 90% of our participants, they came from 7 most affected provinces, which were Jakarta, West Java, Central Java, East Java, Bali, Banten, and South Sulawesi. If we look at the socio-demographic characteristic of our respondents, most of our respondents were female in adult age, which is range from 25 to 45 years old. Most of them were married, Muslim, and then work in a private company or as civil servant. They were the holder of bachelor degree and postgraduate degrees. So we can see here that our participant actually well-educated population. About the experience in contact with COVID-19 patient, about 80% of our participants, they haven't been any contact with COVID-19 patient. However, about 3.6% of our participants, they had previous contact with COVID-19 patient. Majority of our respondents, which was about 70.9%, identified their level of knowledge as average. Online news, social media, and television were the most accessed sources of information regarding COVID-19. Interestingly, about word of mouth, more married respondents included this as source of information than unmarried respondents. In regard to disease background information, most of the respondents, nearly 100% actually, were aware that COVID-19 is a viral disease. About mode of transmission, more than 86%, they agree that saliva droplet and contaminated surfaces are the main mode of transmission of COVID-19. Interestingly, those who had contact with active COVID-19 patients were more likely to perceive food and water as mode of transmission. Moreover, more than 81% of our respondents, they believe that hand sanitizing, physical distancing, wearing a face mask, and staying at home were effective control measures regarding COVID-19. We assess the risk perception of our respondents in regard to newness, severity, infectiousness, contagiousness, seriousness, and total cases of COVID-19. In general, the respondents perceive that COVID-19 is a high-risk disease. Most respondents also perceive that COVID-19 as an emerging disease, very infectious, and the severity range from severe to very severe. About the same number, they agreed that it is a very serious disease. More than 91% of our study population perceived that virus spread rapidly within days to immediate, and also believe that the total number of cases varied between high and very high. The perception of risk tolerance among our study population were examined by looking at their perception on preparedness, ability to control the risk, efficacy, and self-efficacy. As you can see on the screen, that most of our respondents, they believe their readiness in COVID-19 was between unprepared to quite prepared. The ability to control the risk also distributed in the middle, which is fairly able to able. Fortunately, our study population, they believe in the efficacy of control measure and they willing to carry out the measures. Motivating factors are actually crucial to drive the implementation of control measures. As you can see here, that the main motivation of performing control measure because of they are responsible for their own health, they want to prevent spreading of COVID-19 to the people, as well as they trust in the control measures. The most dominant hindering factors, however, is caused by lack of facilities. For example, hard to find hand wash facilities or they don't have any face mask, followed by peer pressure from those who do not carry out the measures. So here are the association between perception and individual factors. We found that level of anxiety from our study population was about right, appropriate, because they mostly distributed highly in the anxious to quite anxious. Then we conclude that in general, respondents have a good understanding of COVID-19. Online news, social media, and television are the main source of information on COVID-19. After having direct contact with COVID-19 patients, people believe in other modes of transmission, for example, waterborne and foodborne. And in general, we found that people, they perceive that COVID-19 is a high risk. However, they also believe that they are capable of controlling the risk, they are moderately ready to face the risk, and they believe in the efficacy of promoted control measures and willing to implement them. That's why we found that the appropriate level of anxiety due to COVID-19 was found in our study population. So here are some references, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Miller. Appreciate you sharing the international perspective and reminding us that this is a global issue that we're dealing with. Glad to see that the Indonesian population is actually taking this pretty seriously and not trying to play it down. So just before I introduce our next presenter, I just want to remind you all about the sponsorship stuff up here. Make sure that if you want to set up meetings or you want to get in touch with the sponsors, if you click on those links, you can actually get to have one-on-one meetings virtually with the sponsors. So make sure you're engaging with that. But again, remember, when you do it, hold down the control button, then click on it and it opens it in a new box, and then you can get to still hear the presenter. And you don't want to miss the next guy. I'm really actually particularly proud to be able to introduce our next speaker. He and I have both studied and partied together over many years. His hygiene career progression continues to impress many, and I'm watching him particularly well and close, and I'm liking to be able to say, that guy, yep, we were good mates at uni. So the next session is on the same lines as Miller's. It's the international focus, and I'm proud to introduce Andy McCarthy, who's the Principal Advisor for Health and Hygiene at Rio Tinto, and his presentation for COVID-19 management in a high-risk country. Please don't forget to use the chat. Say hello to him. Many of you know him. Welcome, Andy.
Good day. My name is Andy McCarthy. I'm coming to you from Mongolia. Today I'm going to talk about our COVID-19 response in Mongolia, referencing a paper called Early Policy Actions and Emergency Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic in Mongolia, Experiences and Challenges. This paper was written by a colleague of mine at the Mongolian National University of Medical Science, so it's not my work, I'm just presenting it on his behalf. So during December 2019, an outbreak of an unknown virus originated in Wuhan, China. This novel coronavirus, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, is a new pathogen causing COVID-19 viral pneumonia. Mongolia has a population of approximately 3.3 million people and has a long and severe winter, frequently seeing temperatures below -30 degrees. The general population are considered vulnerable to COVID-19 due to chronic comorbidity or non-communicable disease. So cardiovascular disease, obesity, ischemic heart disease being the most prevalent. Early on in this pandemic, the only concern was China, but this situation quickly escalated and was declared a public health emergency of international concern in January and a pandemic in March. So this presentation is based on the government of Mongolia response to protect their population. So for context, there's a couple of maps. So Mongolia sits between Russia and China, and on the second map we can see where Wuhan is in relation to Beijing and Mongolia. So we have multiple flights. We were having multiple flights a day from many parts of China. We cross trucks into China daily, and we have many train cross the border. So the Mongolian disaster protection law and policy were established in accordance with the Sendai framework. So globally, best practice, all countries should address their disaster preparedness and pandemic response in accordance with this framework. So under the Sendai framework, future pandemic preparedness should not be neglected and has shown to be an essential tool in population protection. So Mongolia is a lower middle income country that has the longest shared border with China. Given the proximity of China and the hundreds of border crossings per day, the government of Mongolia began to implement control measures to minimise risk of an outbreak in January 2020. The trade between Mongolia and China is extensive, with hundreds of trucks carrying natural resources, for example, coal and copper, crossing from Mongolia, and multiple planes and trains coming into Mongolia from China daily. Country-specific and generalised guidelines for detection and control were quickly developed and released, taking into account previous experience and lessons learned from the 2002 SARS outbreak and the 2012 MERS outbreak. The state central administrative body in charge of health matters, the National Centre for Communicable Disease, the National Centre for Zoonotic Disease, the National Centre for Public Health and the Health Development Centre were all charged with specific tasks to ensure preparedness for response. So just a bit of a graph on, or table on case history. So back in January, end of January, we had 8,236 cases which were confined to China. As we move forward in the months, we can see the numbers jump considerably, and that also coupled with spread outside of China and into other countries. So at the time of putting this together, which was end of October, there was a total of 43 million cases, with a bit over 4 million active and 1.1 million fatalities. So in January, the government of Mongolia, through the National Emergency Management Association, stood up a State Emergency Committee, or a SEC, to manage the evolving situation. The SEC has powers under executive order and the disaster protection law to protect the country from any imminent threat or natural disaster. The SEC was, and still is to this day, being led by a colonel of the Mongolian Armed Forces. So by early February, Mongolia had implemented a number of controls at ranging levels throughout the hierarchy of control. These controls kept Mongolia COVID-19 free until the first reported case on the 10th of March 2020, where a French expatriate tested positive after entering the country. The controls implemented include countrywide health promotion, so recommendations on the use of respiratory protection or facial barriers, reminding about hand washing, sanitising and personal hygiene. There's a state communication was restricted to one daily update at 11 o'clock from the same source. So this ensured a consistent message. There was a restriction and then suspension of international travel and a suspension of training and educational activities from all levels, from kindergarten to university. Public gatherings were also banned, which had a significant effect on the economy, as the two major tourist attractions for Mongolia are in February and July. So Sagansa, which the National New Year celebrations are in February, and Naadam, which is a celebration of Mongolia, in July. So these generally bring in thousands and thousands of tourists, which they didn't this year. So effective border controls so far have been one of the most effective preventative measures taken, is a quote from the paper. So borders were closed in line with the escalation of outbreaks in neighbouring countries. So between January and March, flights were starting to be suspended between Mongolia and, so in January, Beijing, Hong Kong and Huhot. In February, Tokyo, Bangkok, Incheon and Busan. And then in March, Irkutsk and Ulan-Ude. And on March the 11th, all international flights were suspended, and that remains in place to this day. So on the 15th of March, the SEC initiated repatriation flights for Mongolian nationals to return home from locations around the world. Given Mongolia is quite a safe place at the moment, some of the countries these people were living in were not. So each month, around 15 flights are scheduled to return Mongolians home from around the world. Preference is given to elderly, young, pregnant and unwell. The SEC must approve all applications to return. And at the time of writing, around 9,000 citizens had returned to Mongolia, with a further 8,000 remaining abroad who have applied to come home. Now, the quarantine and self-isolation protocols for Mongolia were quite harsh in the beginning. So it was 21 days in government supervised quarantine, followed by 14 days of self-isolation at home. This has since been reduced to these 21 days of government supervised quarantine. The Government of Mongolia also released a ministerial order which included a testing and retesting protocol for isolated patients, close contact patients, suspected, probable and confirmed cases. Each person in quarantine also has a twice daily temperature check to ensure any fever is identified early. So the protocol in the table you can see has a mix between rapid testing and PCR testing while in quarantine. So the order, which is 76 pages, was modelled off the WHO interim guideline for coronavirus infection, and it covers a range of different topics. The document was passed through government in April and is still the primary reference that we have. There have been some amendments to remain consistent with the WHO guidelines also. So today, which was October 27 when I was writing this, Mongolia has had 340 total cases. We've had 0 fatalities, and importantly, there's been 0 community transmission of the virus. So the Mongolian case shows that with advanced preparedness, robust preventative systems to mount an effective response to a pandemic is indeed possible for a low to middle income country, which was at high risk given our proximity to China. So finally, a reference to the paper. It's available in The Lancet, and I'm happy to share the link if anyone would like it. Special thanks to Renshin, who is the primary lead author on this paper, for allowing me to use his work and share the success of Mongolia that we've had. So thank you.
Hey, Andy, mate. No, it's coming into winter there. Stay safe in the cold, hey? Great presentation, and pass on thanks to the other guys as well. Just before we move on to our next presentation, just a quick reminder again, trivia up here. Day 1 and Day 2 is there. Some of you may not have seen Day 1 trivia yesterday. Please get in, make some questions, look at some questions, make up some answers. There's some really difficult ones, there's some really easy ones, but get involved. Okay, so our next session is a little closer to home. Today we're talking about the impacts of heavy bushfire smoke on the Sydney workplaces between 2019 and 2020. I'm sure many of you remember last summer. Hopefully we won't have any repeats of that this year. Today's session is presented by Phil Turner, our occupational hygienist for Workplace Environment Consultants Proprietary Limited. And as always, here's your opportunity to use the chat feature and ask the presenter lots of questions during the session, and Phil will be responding to you directly. Thank you.
Thank you to the AIOH for inviting me to present at this virtual conference. My presentation is on the impact of heavy bushfire smoke on Sydney workplaces. I'll be dealing with bushfire smoke and its health effects, ambient air quality goals in New South Wales and Australia, and the associated air quality index, and advice from New South Wales Health, Safe Work New South Wales and Safe Work Australia on control of smoke exposure, and the ambient air monitoring program in Sydney, and why some sites needed to use an on-site aerosol photometer. My name's Philip Turner. I'm a certified occupational hygienist. Bushfire smoke, it contains hundreds of different compounds. Of particular interest is fine particulate matter, PM2.5, which is 50% of the particles are above 2.5 micron, 50% are less than 2.5 micron. It can go deep into the lungs, can cause inflammation. It can enter the bloodstream and affect body systems. I've got some useful information on health effects from the Centre for Air Pollution, Energy and Health Research, and they had a very useful document, fact sheet on bushfire smoke. What are the health impacts and what can we do to minimise the exposure? Those effects include irritated airways, nose and eyes. They include increased use of asthma medication, increased healthcare attendances, increased hospital admissions for respiratory complaints, increased cardiovascular problems, including cardiac arrest and mortality. Their estimate between the years 2001 and 2013, looking at 184 bushfire incidents, they estimated 197 premature deaths, 436 hospitalisations for cardiovascular, and 787 hospitalisations for respiratory issues. Recent modelling of the 2019-2020 bushfire season estimated 400 premature deaths and over 3,000 hospital admissions in the eastern states. That was from the Medical Journal of Australia and has been cited in the Royal Commissions. The ambient air quality goal in New South Wales and Australia is in the National Environmental Protection Measure. The aim is 25 micrograms per cubic metre, and that's as a 24-hour average. That 25 micrograms per cubic metre is equivalent to an air quality index of 100. New South Wales Health has some advice based upon those AQIs with a FAIR index of 67 to 99. They say unusually sensitive people should reduce or reschedule strenuous outdoor activities. At a poor index, 100 to 149, sensitive groups should reduce strenuous outdoor activities. At a very poor index, 150 to 199, all adults should reduce strenuous outdoor activities. When it's hazardous, all adults should avoid strenuous outdoor activities. What can be done to control smoke exposure? Work scheduling, personal protective equipment, and recirculating HEPA air purifiers indoors. Safe Work New South Wales indoors, interestingly, didn't include the HEPA filter recommendation, and I think that issue deserves more attention. Their advice was to work with property managers to monitor air quality, take action if quality was not within acceptable levels, keep staff informed, and have emergency plan provisions. They had advice for outdoors: reschedule work if possible, conduct a risk assessment first, provide protective equipment such as face masks, ensure effective communication, beware of fires near the proposed work areas, follow advice from emergency services, evacuate if needed, monitor outdoor using Air Quality Alerts New South Wales, that's the online system from the EPA, and access information from New South Wales Health. Safe Work Australia also put out some advice: working indoors where possible, rescheduling outdoor work, ensure plant is functioning correctly and has not been affected by dust or debris, cleaning dust and debris from outdoor surfaces, and providing PPE, and they include eye protection. The EPA in New South Wales operates 17 air monitoring stations in the Sydney area. At the time of the bushfires, online PM2.5 was only available as a 24-hour average. The maximum PM2.5 near the City of Sydney on the 10th of December 2019 was 534 micrograms per cubic metre. That was recorded at Rozelle, and that was the peak during that bushfire season. Some clients, construction sites in particular, requested the use of ambient air monitoring on site. The most cost-effective way of doing that is with an aerosol photometer. I used a TSI Dust Track Model 2. It had a PM2.5 impactor, an Auto Zero model, a module, and a Canalec tripod-based system, i.e. that's an Agent G2 Plus data logger. We set it to send SMS alerts at 100 micrograms per cubic metre. Importantly, there was a calibration factor of 0.38 for ambient air. This came from a TSI application note which discusses the various bits of research comparing this device with airborne smoke levels. There are other devices available, such as the AirQual from AirMet. More recent research has suggested a calibration factor of 0.25. Delp and Singer published some research based on California wildfire smoke. We recorded a peak 1 minute average PM2.5 of 1330. That included the calibration factor of 0.38. Now, a one-on-one agreement with the EPA isn't guaranteed because it is a different sample location, several kilometres apart, and our device was on a multi-storey building. PM2.5 did vary from day to day. In that high week, on the 10th of December was the highest at 102. The other days that week ranged from 8 to 14, which are effectively normal. They varied from hour to hour. This is the data from the EPA Rozelle on the 10th of December 2019, and they ranged from 58 to 534. This hourly data was not available on the day. Our calibration factor varied over time. On that day, it varied from 0.14 to 0.31. And despite that overestimate, on-site aerosol photometer allowed outdoor work to proceed when conditions were satisfactory, but official readings were lagging. So exposure to bushfire smoke, it can be controlled by work scheduling, personal protective equipment, and the use of air purifiers indoors. And that process can be assisted by on-site monitoring as required. The online air quality index and PM2.5 are now provided hourly in New South Wales, which is a much more useful way to present information. And I noticed at the time that other states were providing data closer to real time. So thank you very much. It's the end of the presentation.
Hey, thanks, Phil. Awesome presentation. I think there's been a lot of questions answered in the chat, so please, if you haven't already, join up to that and have a look through there. Thanks, Dusty, for the link to the it was indoor air quality SED group as well. So excellent, good share from everybody there. Great question from you too, Christy. All right, so our next session is firefighter exposure, and it's presented by Sue Reid, who's the Associate Professor for Edith Cowan University. So please make her welcome, give her a big virtual round of applause, and don't forget to use the chat button and the features when you're presenting.
Hi, welcome to my presentation on firefighter exposure. Just a little bit of a background to start with. So if we think about the issues that we have, we've got people exposed to a very complex mixture of toxins which either have acute effects such as carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide, nitrogen oxides, etc., and even hydrogen chloride, or they have chronic effects and cause upper respiratory irritation. We also have the potential of asphyxiation, which can be problematic. There's been a lot of work, a lot of information in the news over the last 5 years about cancers in firefighters, and that they seem to be developing certain cancers, although more recent data has shown that those cancers are quite broad. And in some states in Australia, this has meant that they've changed the way in which they report these cases and what types of claims firefighters can make. In the past, unless it was a cancer linked specifically to an occupation, they weren't able to do a workers' compensation claim. But in New South Wales and other states, that's changed. What we've decided in working with the firefighters is to come up with a method of trying to estimate what sorts of chemicals they get exposed to. But we can't use traditional sampling methods as we do in occupational hygiene, because we're talking about people actually in an emergency situation, trying to deal with an emergency in a very hostile environment, and we can't take time out of their work to put sampling equipment on to collect samples. And we worked with them and we came up with what we think is an innovative method to monitor exposure for firefighters. What this involved is collecting firefighter clothing after there'd been a fire incident, and they actually normally they take their clothing off and they put it into a sealed, what they call decontamination bags. So when the clothing goes into those bags, they're sealed and sent away for decontamination. And in this case, they sealed them, they sent them to us, and we put them in a cold room until we actually started analysis. So we then took the clothing out of the sealed contamination bag, put them into a plastic box like the one you can see in this picture here, and we connected the analyzer, which was a GasMat 440, which we could select 25 specific chemicals to quantify potential exposures, as well as a library of up to 5,000 other chemicals to do a qualitative assessment of what else might be in the environment that the firefighters are exposed to. We sampled for a minimum of 8 hours, and the results I'll show in some cases go out to 24 and 48 hours to see what behaviour occurs with this clothing, because that's important, because not just are the firefighters potentially exposed, so are the people responsible in the laundries for decontaminating the clothing. Following the data, we downloaded it, and we could actually then estimate what the exposures to various areas are, and we collected a lot of material. So what sorts of analysis were we looking at? So in conjunction with the literature and the firefighters, we selected 20 chemicals that were considered to be potential exposures in the workplace to have the highest exposures, and these are all listed in front of you. The first lot of clothing we did, phase 1, was where we actually, and the team actually went and worked with the trainee firefighters and got tested several sets of clothing where they're actually where firefighters are being trained to fight fires. So these are a very controlled scenario. So we knew what the fuel was and a range of other areas. And it was interesting to see that the highest exposures in these sorts of fires, and there was a mixture of what we call cold fires and hot fires, the highest exposures in cold and hot fires were to acrolein, formaldehyde, as we know as a class 1, acetyl hydride, hydrogen chloride, hydrogen cyanide, which was a surprise, ethanol, and phosgene was the other surprise at the time. So then we went to phase 2. And with phase 2, we actually got fire clothing from specific fires. And this particular fire results you're seeing here, where the highest exposures were to hexene, styrene, hydrogen cyanide, and again acrolein, was in relation to a range of different types of fires. Set 1, 2, and 3 were building and structural fires. Set 4 was a motor vehicle fire, and you can see that what emissions came out varied between different types of fire emissions. So how does the off-gassing work? So over a period of time, we wanted to see, did the clothing concentration coming off, being readmitted, decrease over time? And it did. But as you can see, that in most cases, it took nearly 24 hours for the concentrations to reduce at least 0.5%. Now, some of these exposures that people were being exposed to in their breathing zone, which is what would be going on, is in the above the current workplace stills, and in some cases the long term, but particularly the stills, which was of concern. The other thing is to think about is how firefighters handle their clothing out in the field. So the issue, one of the areas that people discussed was that, well, it's not an issue because firefighters are wearing breathing apparatus out in the field. But if you watch firefighters at a fire scene, after they've finished fighting the fire, they take off their breathing apparatus, but they leave their outer clothing on in most cases. And that means that these chemicals that are off-gassing following the fire are going into their breathing zone, so they're potentially exposed. Not all fires behave the same way. This one was an interesting one. This was motor vehicle fire, and so for the first 24 hours, the emissions came off fairly regularly. Then after 24 hours, the emissions suddenly increased, suddenly went right up, particularly in regards to the styrene, which means that with the clothing being at room temperature, that it took a while to start being readmitted out of the clothing, but after a period that suddenly jumped. So what were the findings we had? So we found that firefighters are potentially exposed to levels of airborne contaminants immediately following a fire episode, particularly which could be hazardous, and when they're not wearing their self-breathing apparatus, self-contained breathing apparatus. Several of the levels measured, such as acrolein, formaldehyde, phosgene, are well above the recommended exposure standards, in some cases the recommended stills, and this was a concern. Another area is that people who may be handling this clothing prior to decontamination need to be considered, because we need to make sure they're protected as well. And as far as we know, no one's looked at those exposures, and that's part of what we'd like to see done in the future. So in conclusion, a couple of areas we think is this study needs to be continued and expanded to include firefighters dealing just not structural fires, but bushfire scenarios. We need to get a lot more clothing. We've only done a really smaller number. We need to do a lot more, because this looks about and fire, and particularly bushfires, because of the fact that bushfire fighters have limited access to respiratory protection, and most bushfires they're only using particulate type respiratory protection, and there's the potential to be exposed to quite a range of gaseous and vapor type exposures, which is which can be problematic. The other area is when firefighters finish fighting a fire, what they do is dress down. In other words, in the order in which they take off their scuba gear and their clothing needs to be reviewed. And I know that the particular group this was done on, this study was done on, they have been reviewing these processes. So basically what needs to happen is that they need to take their outer clothing off before they take off their self-contained breathing apparatus, so that they're still breathing filtered air, and that clothing needs to go into a sealed container before anybody takes off their self-contained breathing apparatus. The other area that really needs close looking at is how this clothing is handled when it goes to commercial laundries. Is it left in, who takes it out of the decontamination bags? Is it done under extraction ventilation? What sort of filters are used, etc. So that's another area that really needs a lot of study done. There's a number of references that I've provided here to support what some of the issues with firefighters are, and particularly the toxicity, and we're really worried about that for the future. I'd like to thank you for listening, and if you want to learn more about this, please contact any of the team who are part of this paper, and we'd love to discuss it. If you want to fund some of this study, of course, we'd love to hear from you as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. That's a very interesting and unique study on the firefighter exposures. So much activity going on in the chat, really hard to try and keep up with all those questions. So thank you for contributing to that. This next session is the identification and management of hexavalent chromium dust exposures on the gas turbines in the LNG industry. And it's presented by another good mate of mine, Will O'Callaghan. He's the occupational hygienist and the HSE supervisor for Santos. This session's been sponsored by CAC Gases and Instrumentations. So please continue to use the chat features and ask Will questions during the session, and hopefully he'll get back to you.
Hi, welcome to my presentation. My name's Will O'Callaghan. I'm an occupational hygienist for Santos. This one's on the identification and management of hexavalent chromium dust exposure on gas turbines in the LNG industry. I'm a certified occupational hygienist. A lot of the presentation you'll see today is based on the Darwin LNG plant, DLNG. I'm also, because I'm from Darwin, I'm a hottie as well, a hygienist of the territory, which you might be familiar with that Facebook group. So let's rip into it. Just a bit of background. So we perform a lot of routine turbine maintenance on site at our LNG plant, and late in 2018 we became aware that we potentially had a hexavalent chromium dust issue, and it was depositing on the hot or the combustion sections of the turbine. We didn't identify it. It actually was one of our maintenance vendors who'd come to site. They work around the country doing this kind of specialist turbine work. They'd seen a safety bulletin about hazardous green dust, and he was seeing it in our turbines. So that kicked off a process to identify, was it hexavalent chromium, the dust we're seeing? And if it is, what do we need to do? So the rest of the presentation really is around the chronological order of how we dealt with this as an issue through identification to control. A little bit about turbine maintenance. It is critical work. This is critical equipment that we have on site. We are doing routine maintenance on each individual turbine every 6 to 12 months. So we have 11 turbines on site at Darwin LNG, and 6 of those are really driving the compressors on site. So an LNG plant is like a big fridge. We've got 3 different refrigerants which are pumped around the site. And they're pushed through with the compressors, and this is the drivetrain that pushes those through. So this is critical equipment that we have to keep running all the time. So what did it look like? Up there in the top right-hand corner, you can see that fine green dust depositing on the surface there. So when you take out one of our turbines out of its enclosure and you're opening up that combustion section where the engine ignites the gas that it's running off, that's where we see that combustion, those products of combustion plate out there. So we verified that this was hexavalent chromium using the OSHA wipe test model, and we found up to about 83 micrograms doing that wipe test, as you can see. Typical deposits. So this deposit itself is actually really baked on. So we actually need a solvent to clean it off. That's what our maintenance team typically use. So basically it's pretty hard baked on, and that's because the temperatures in the turbines themselves. So we need those maintenance teams to get in there, clean those surfaces off, and do their inspections. You can see there the wipe test method we use, and the pretty sad state of that particular filter we tried to use. So it is pretty hard to come off, and that gives you a bit of an indication of its ability to become a dust and become airborne. We don't know what the particular source is of the hexavalent chromium. You go back a few years in our maintenance procedures, you can't see it there. We don't know if it's coming through on the feed gas. Is it part of our new combustors, which we just put in? High-grade steel has we have a lot of chromium in them. Or is it some of the anti-seizers we're using in these turbines? There's a thought out there that high content calcium anti-seizers is potentially leading to hexavalent chromium becoming there. So key takeaway point from this slide is we verified that this was present using that OSHA wipe sample technique. So how hazardous is it? Well, if you go to the Safe Work Australia standard for airborne contaminants, it's got a time-weighted average for an 8-hour exposure of 0.05 milligrams per cubic meter. It's designated as a carcinogenic 1A, and it's a sensitizer. It's also currently under review as part of the whole WES review process. I can't go into all that info that's on the slide, but basically get into those reviews, have a look. It's a really good jumping off point for some of that research. And in the next slide, we'll talk about why it's being reduced, or what it's being reduced to. But the key reason why is because coming out of America, there's a lot of research around the potential for lung cancers from this. And we're really following suit from some of those requirements overseas. I haven't kept on top of a lot of these WES reviews, but this one in particular, it's slotted for a pretty big reduction. So currently it's 0.05 milligrams per cubic meter as a time-weighted average, or 50 micrograms. and they're looking to drop that down to 0.007 micrograms. So that's a reduction of around 7,000 times. So a pretty big reduction, which could be in place. So obviously, a lot of the controls, which we'll talk about next, we have to really consider with the controls that we put in place, which were aimed at sort of that 0.05 time-weighted average. Are they still going to be adequate for our exposures moving forward if that review gets up and we go to that level? So what did we do? At first, we categorically identified that hexavalent chromium was present. It's in the turbine blades. When we pull that turbine out, we have to control it. We needed to make sure that our workforce was very clear on, well, what are, oops, let's jump the slide, let me go back. So we had to make sure that we had a risk assessment process in place which clearly identified what's the hazard, what's the routes of entry, what are our key controls, and make it specific to the turbine tasks that the guys are doing. So that was really important to us. And the way we did that was we developed a hygiene risk assessment or a health risk assessment. I'd love to take credit for this one, but it was Tamara Fritchley who put it together for us, our other hygienist at Santos. And this was really a key control document which we have on site. This document now, we were using, it was up there on the turbine decks, and now it's being slotted into the maintenance procedures as well. So it's been written in as whole points around testing, around types of respiratory protection and gloves to be wearing. So in terms of first step, making sure we had a controlled, focused approach, a health risk assessment, which I identified those controls like a full face respirator and gloves, was that key step for us because we didn't want to go off and try and quantify exposure without doing the controls first. I talk a lot about in this presentation about referenced methods, but I did want to talk about the indicative sampling we do. We use these chrome checks. So you've probably seen lead checks for lead paint tests. Same thing, except they detect hexavalent chromium. So you don't have to, these are immediate, you don't have to wait for a white test to come back from the lab 2 days later. And the key thing where we use these, they're very easy to use. Our mechanical technicians, they'll clean those surfaces of that green dust, and then they'll do these swab tests, and it gives them a really good sense of confidence that they've cleaned it to a level when it comes back without that color change. We don't use the color change to determine any concentrations. We just use it as an indicative test to say it's present or not. So if we've cleaned the surface, it should come back 0. If it doesn't come back 0, you clean it again. And we've done some air sampling, I should say. So we've done the OSHA method for wipe testing, but we use the NIOSH one for air sampling. So we've done a few area samples inside the turbine enclosures, and those results have all come back very low. But we've done a couple of personal samples, but we haven't really done enough to really give us good results. It's certainly not significant in terms of trying to do any statistics. However, we are seeing that in that critical task of cleaning the surfaces of the turbine as they pull it out, it's becoming airborne, so we have to control it. So that's an area we know as part of our recommendations moving forward. We need to do more of that monitoring. So just very quickly, in summary, so based on the review and the sampling conducted, there is potential for exposure to hexavalent chromium during turbine maintenance activities. That contaminant is a product of combustion, which deposits onto those hot sections of the turbines, and it presents to us as an inhalation and a skin absorption risk. A controls-based or controlled focused approach using a hygiene risk assessment has been really successful for us to raise the awareness around the risks and the required controls, while we can go forward and do those exposure assessments later. And the health risk assessment, it's been instrumental in trying to influence the maintenance procedures and the employees at the work front. It's got whole points for white sampling and swab sampling. It's got critical controls around PPE and particularly respiratory protection. It really tries to help talk about the importance of cleaning those surfaces and waste disposal requirements so you don't get a secondary exposure potential. And probably one other point I wanted to touch on, which doesn't really fit in the summary, but is key for us was that information sharing. So we didn't know about this until we got a safety bulletin coming through from our contractors. So those bulletins, and now we're seeing quite a few of them since 2018, was instrumental in the industry itself becoming aware of this issue. And we've now seen sister plants all around the country where they're finding this as an issue and they need to control it. So it's been brilliant to be able to see the industry react and share that. Two recommendations that we have moving forward really are to look at air sampling to quantify that potential exposure, particularly for inhalation risks. And we really want to focus on those turbine maintenance vendors. They go site to site chasing shutdowns and all around the country. So they've got a really high exposure potential compared to, say, a mechanical technician who might only touch it a few times a year. And then the other part of it is we need to do some urine analysis sampling. That'll tell us the skin absorption potential, but it'll also tell us a bit about the adequacy of our controls. And it's a medical surveillance requirement for hexavalent chromium to do that sampling. So that's what I have for you today.
Mate, nice work, Will. Information sharing there, you said, was a key issue. Mate, I know who I'm going to be coming to when I next get a hexavalent chromium request. Well done, mate. Thank you very much. Our next session is uncontrolled airborne chemicals in a SAC room. It's a case study and it's presented by Michael Tolmie, who's with OHS Regulatory Specialists, with NOP SEMA NOPSEMA, who do all the offshore regulatory work. Make sure you please use the chat features. I see that pretty much everyone is in there now doing this. Keep a track of what's going on. If you're not looking at the chat and not following the chat, you're missing out on this. Thanks for this, Michael.
Welcome everyone, my name is Michael Tolmie. I work for the Offshore Oil and Gas Regulator in NOPSEMA as an Occupational Hygiene Inspector. Today I'll be addressing what does NOPSEMA do, the inspection objectives, the work practices which led to an uncontrolled airborne chemicals in the SAC room, the actions required to reduce risk to the workforce. NOPSEMA is Australia's independent expert regulator for health and safety, well integrity and environmental management for offshore petroleum and greenhouse gas storage activities in Commonwealth waters. The areas shown in grey on the map. In Australia, the majority of our petroleum wealth is found offshore. Australia is currently the world's largest LNG exporter, and Australian workers performed over 10 million working hours in 2019 to 2020. What does NOPSEMA do? We assess permissioning documents such as safety cases against strict criteria set out in federal law. We inspect oil and gas companies' compliance with the Act and its regulations. We investigate all reports of non-compliance. We take enforcement action to rectify non-compliance and hold parties to account. We also provide advice on safety, well integrity and environmental management matters to improve understanding and promote compliance and encourage continuous improvement. The image on the left shows a bird's eye view of an offshore drilling rig, which is a large structure with facilities for well drilling, to explore and develop infrastructure to extract, store and process petroleum and natural gas that lies in rock formations beneath the seabed. The primary mode of transport to attend is by helicopter, and inspectors normally travel in pairs. In December 2019, Inspector Nick Webster and myself attended an offshore drilling rig to perform an inspection for hazardous chemical management. Our objective was to inspect the safety management system for hazardous chemicals used to provide and maintain a physical environment that was safe for the workforce. This included reviewing the safety case, procedures and records, interviewing management and members of the workforce, inspecting plant and equipment. A written summary of the inspection outcomes was provided at the offshore facility and preliminary observations and findings discussed. A full report containing findings, conclusions and recommendations was provided and discussed with the operator at a subsequent onshore meeting. A full walkthrough of the facility was conducted with a focus on inspecting areas that use hazardous chemicals. A SAC room is a place to store powdered hazardous chemicals in sacks or bags. These are then cut open and tipped into a manual hopper for processing. The picture on the left shows the SAC room, which is found below the drill floor. It is a windowless room with forced air ventilation by fans for the two operators inside. There is a pallet of bagged powder chemicals, a mixing table to rip and tip sacks, a white bulky bag for collection of emptied sacks, and a local exhaust ventilation connected to the mixing table to capture the chemical dust generated during the process. The picture on the right shows the SACS room during the operation of the equipment. As mentioned, the process is for operators to cut open bags of powdered hazardous chemicals and tip them into the manual hopper, where they are mixed up with aqueous solutions or synthetic oil to form drilling mud or fluid. As you can see from the picture, airborne chemical dust does not appear to be controlled at the manual hopper, with evidence of visible dust on the system, loading area and surrounding structures. An inspection of the technical controls found the following. The installed dust extraction system was ineffective in capturing the chemical dust from the mixing table, and the discharge from the dust extraction system vented back into the work area as shown on the photo on the right. Safety data sheets classified the chemicals as hazardous with airborne exposure standard limits. An exposure assessment had not been undertaken. The operators had received respiratory medical evaluation, spirometry, fit testing for a full face mask, and respiratory awareness training. However, no evidence was produced to demonstrate that a formal assessment of the assigned respiratory equipment had been performed or a filter change schedule was established. At the time of the inspections, operators were not wearing atmosphere-supplying respirators as per the operator's policies. As such, an uncontrolled occupational exposure risk was identified. During conversations with operators, it was determined that the air pulsation equipment, the photograph on the left, used to displace dust from the local exhaust ventilation filters, caused dust to vent back into the work area, and hence this equipment was not functioning correctly and remained unused by the workers. When filters were removed and cleaned with high pressure air, they were done so in the adjacent work area, known as the moon pool, where the main drill is connected to the seafloor, the photograph on the right. Drilling personnel and subsea engineers frequent this area. No risk assessment had been conducted or safe work procedure was established for this practice. Following the identification of the occupational exposure and non-functioning technical controls, a review was conducted and a decision made to take enforcement action. Prohibition notice and improvement notice were subsequently issued. The prohibition notice was issued to address the immediate threat to occupational health by ensuring suitable respiratory protection was supplied. The improvement notice was issued to ensure implementation of a series of controls at the source. In simple terms, we stopped the job, removed the immediate threat, documented the risk, and made a written agreement of the necessary changes and actions to be taken by the responsible parties to perform the task safely. The operation of the manual hopper is integral to the drilling operations. If there is no chemical mixing, there is no mud or fluid, and there is no drilling. The operator complied with the enforcement action, implementing controls to reduce the exposure risk by installing ductwork to discharge exhausted air overboard, partially enclosing the mixing table, and conducting an exposure assessment by a third party to demonstrate efficacy of controls and airborne contaminants were below exposure standards. They also updated the chemical mixing procedures to document the changes in operator work practices which were made to reduce dust generation during the operation of the manual hopper. The operator also complied with the requirements of the notice by fitting a shroud at the ventilation system. Further identified deficiencies observed included the chemical inventory was not kept up to date, incompatible chemicals were stored together, the respiratory protection program was not properly implemented, hazardous materials management refresher training was not being conducted, and internal auditing was not focused on the hazards. For example, personnel had received hazardous material information systems training in 2007, and because of the findings from the inspection, the inspectors formed the opinion that employees who manage hazardous materials require regular training and a refresher period should be established and implemented. NOPSEMA expects systems to be implemented, functional, maintained, audited, and personnel to be competent to manage the risk to as low as reasonably practicable. Beyond the initial enforcement, recommendations by the regulator in the plan inspection report focused on the implementation of hazardous chemical management systems, including safe practices for removing and cleaning dust extraction filters, maintaining a respiratory filter change schedule, maintaining a hazardous chemical inventory, segregation of incompatible chemicals, providing chemical management refresher training, and performing auditing. The operator responded with agreed action and closeout dates which were tracked to completion. Approximately 6 months later, in May 2020, the operator installed a new dust extraction system, established and implemented preventative maintenance management plans for the system, and updated practices for removing and cleaning dust extraction filters. This case study highlights the uncontrolled airborne hazardous chemicals and a failure to inspect and maintain safety management systems in workplaces can adversely impact worker health through occupational exposure. A combination of regulatory enforcement based on the hierarchy of controls and report recommendations were required to control the risk. Testing, maintenance, and auditing of the implemented hazardous management system by the operator and inspection by the regulator are necessary mechanisms to limit exposure and maintain the health and safety of the workforce. Our purpose in presenting this case is to allow industry to learn about the risk posed by uncontrolled systems and the measures that can be taken to control the risk to create safer workplaces. Thank you. Should you need any further information, please find my contact information below.
Hi, that was quick finish there, Michael, but thanks for that. Some great visuals, and it's great to have the regulator perspective on that. It's an area that not a lot of us get to see, so the visuals on that makes it a lot more interesting for everybody, so much appreciated, mate. So our next session is effectively removing mercury contamination in oil and gas exploration and production systems. And it's presented by Melanie Windus, who's the business unit manager for occupational hygiene in the ADE group. Melanie is one of those people I never really get to catch up with at conference, but when we do, it's not always at the bar, but she's always a wealth of knowledge and experience to share. So thank you very much for joining us, Melanie, and we look forward to your presentation now.
Hi, my name is Melanie Windust from ADE Group, and I'm really excited to be here talking to you about mercury decontamination and how to eliminate risk, maintenance tasks, and the disposal of previously contaminated equipment. Mercury is a naturally occurring trace constituent of coal, crude oil, natural gas, and gas condensate, and virtually all hydrocarbons contain measurable quantities of mercury. Having worked in the oil and gas industry on and off for the past 25 years, mercury has been an issue that I've really struggled with to find a process to reduce the risk to workers and the environment. Existing controls have utilised additional DEAM vessels or potassium iodide treatment, which causes further environmental issues, and often the process is not adequate to eliminate the risk to workers, and they're still required to wear significant amounts of personal protective equipment. The outcome of this project is really exciting for me, as the decontamination process reduces the exposure likelihood for planned maintenance tasks, but also the really important thing coming up is it eliminates the mercury in decommissioned plant and equipment. I've done it again. There you go. So mercury vapour is a corrosive gas and a cumulative poison that has generally reversible health effects. The health effects from respiration include tightness in the chest, difficulty breathing, fever, headaches, lung inflammation and digestive disturbance. Chronic exposure creates central nervous system damage, kidney and liver damage, tumours, insomnia, fatigue, and even excessive salivation. Mercury vapour is hazardous, but it's not known or suspected carcinogen. Inhalation is the primary route of exposure, with inhaled vapours being most completely absorbed by the lungs. Elemental mercury is only slowly absorbed through the skin, but it does cause irritation to the skin and eyes if exposure occurs. The presence of mercury creates substantial health, safety and environmental issues that reduce efficiencies in maintenance activities and considerably add to the cost in demolition. Mercury can absorb and can be absorbed to carbon and stainless steel process equipment. So understanding the mass, distribution and species along with the corrosion profiles in process equipment, are critical to successful chemical decontamination and spent chemistry processing plans and objectives. Just wanted to mention the process that has been used for the past 10 years, mainly in Thailand, to remove mercury from contaminated equipment. And the potassium iodide process was developed about 50 years ago. So the advantages are that, it's old science, it's well known, the client is really familiar with the process and have processes and control to minimise the exposure. However, it hasn't got 100% or even above 90% good results for removal of mercury, and these expensive chemicals can lead to this process not being as ideal as other processes around. Mercury and iodine need to be kept out of the soils and waterways as they can cause long-term damage to these ecosystems. Chronic poisoning from iodine can lead to skin lesions, reactions, conjunctivitis, bronchitis, asthma. And these processes really do require significant amounts of controls to be put into place while the removal process is being undertaken. And it's slow and inefficient. So what I really want to talk to you today is about a chemical process of removal, where mercury decontamination trials were conducted on oil and gas processing equipment that was either equipment scheduled for decommissioning or it was really high value equipment for reuse. Verification of the differences between initial and final mercury mass loading was measured using an XRF instrumentation that was portable on site. The chemicals were modified for the mercury mass loading and different lengths of time were investigated. Analysis results are used to determine the initial concentration of the contaminants and predetermined points within the system. Continuous analysis will monitor mercury saturation levels in the solution until spent. So that monitoring, that continuous analysis is done on site by technicians in field using an analytical equipment. And then the samples that have been decontaminated in this particular trial were sent off to a laboratory for further analysis and confirmation of the decontamination. So with the two case studies, the removal chemicals they used were strong to extremely powerful mineral acid blends with controlled foaming, various corrosion inhibitors, wetting agents, oxidants, hydrogen sulfide scavengers and hydrogen embrittlement inhibitors that allow controlled penetration and scale removal to metal substrates. Additional oxidizers can be then added in field based on mercury mass distribution species and depth profile. Each formula has an A-B version, and that can be scaled up and scaled down and modified based on the mass removal criteria, the hydrocarbon loading, the scale composition, and the metallurgy or the depth profile. For case study A, the project required performing a study to determine mercury loading, mass loading, distribution, and speciation of various systems prior to the chemical decontamination offshore on the semi-submersible drill ship and onshore well flow test process equipment. Based on this study, chemical decontamination plans and performance monitoring criteria and spent chemistry process plans were developed. A key objective was near total mercury mass removal with the emphasis on not damaging primary steel alloy components. In case study B, this is for the high value equipment for reuse. Well flow test equipment and process systems on a semi-submersible drill ship were contaminated with mercury due to intermittent exposure to high mercury concentration hydrocarbons streams during the well flow test program. A semi-submersible and associated well flow test equipment was scheduled for remobilisation to another production field with lower mercury concentrations in gas and condensate. Mercury chemical decontamination was required primarily to prevent mercury from desorbing from the interior steel process system surfaced during well flow test operations and efficiency mercury sample and analysis data from the new production field. The project required performing a study to determine mercury mass loading, distribution and speciation of various systems prior to the chemical decontamination offshore on the semi-submersible drill ship and onshore well test process equipment. Similar to case study A, the key objective was near total mercury mass removal with an emphasis on not damaging primary steel alloy components. The mass loading per surface area is generally not homogeneous, with systems and varies of exposure, pressure, temperature of process, chemical composition of hydrocarbon streams, and many other factors. What was needed was versatility in the chemical's maximum loading potential for mercury and hydrocarbons. The chemical formula selected was based on the estimated mercury mass per surface area for the various systems required for decontamination. Chemical performance and maximum mercury uptake for these chemicals is well established. The facility of mercury can be increased by up to above 100,000 part per million. Offshore, on the semi-submersible, this meant that the chemistry had a certain mass loading potential and was circulated in 4 piping runs of 4 hours each. The total calculated mass per surface area for offshore piping on the semi-submersible was around 4 grams per metres cubed, with the total mercury mass removal at 418. So as you can see, for that type of mercury removal, it's really not a huge amount of time to get pretty good results. So with the results, this picture here depicts the 6-inch high-pressure flange. They were used to correlate the accuracy of the XRF surface measurements using SEM, EDS, and acid digestion. The top flange depicts the mercury surface concentration contour map pre-chemical treatment. The bottom flange depicts the mercury surface concentration contour map post-chemical treatment. The overlapping grid of each flange represents how the flange was processed into 1-inch steel coupons for SEM, EDS, and acid digestions. Mercury mass reductions are likely to be higher than 90 to 98% mass removal in much of the process unit streams that were decontaminated. But by using the highest mass loading per surface area equipment as a surrogate for the entire process system, an ultra-conservative version standard was established and were able to remove 10 grams per metre squared. These chemicals can also be converted and concentrated into a gel form that's applied to the inside of vessels. It has several application methods that increase its versatility. These products are really useful for if you're just doing a concentrated area for small maintenance jobs. This can significantly reduce time and costs, and is able to be applied very easily to vertical surfaces as well. So with a 98 to 100% mercury contamination removal, the outcome benefits the environment and the people who are maintaining plant and equipment that previously was mercury contaminated. This technology is successful over wide temperature ranges, 10 to 65 degrees, and it's transferable to other industries that contain mercury, and it even removes naturally occurring radioactive material. So some of these other industries could be gold mining, paper milling, or coal power stations. Look, I'm not only passionate about reducing workers' exposure, I'm really a greenie at heart. I'm an environmentalist, and I believe that we can all make a difference. And this is becoming increasingly important in Australia and the world as we progress away from oil and gas, leaving mercury-contaminated sites that are being decommissioned. Thank you, and I'm really happy to be contacted after the symposium for further questions and technical data on this particular project. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. Appreciate the focus, and particularly, I guess this is a bit of a reminder for everyone, the environmental impact is just as important and just a big part of the picture that as occupational hygienists we need to help manage as well. All right, so we're moving on to our next session, and it's about the REST-FIT program, and it's an update that will be presented by Mark Reggers. But before we get into that, we're going to watch the video that was played yesterday that some people missed out on. It was Diane Smith-Gander. She's basically introducing the REST-FIT program in her role in the National Safety Council. So apologies, that's not quite the right name, but she gave a really good presentation. And following straight on from that, we're going to hear from Mark Reggers. Mark's an occupational hygienist and he's a senior application engineer for 3M. And I just want to say I'm pretty proud to be have had regular conversations with Mark and driven as he's driven home from Sydney. He's been passionate about this and the need to implement this system for many, many years. So I don't think many will really fully understand how much considerable time and energy is put into this program. So I really would appreciate you all taking the time to have a listen to this. So again, Diane Smith-Gander, who was presenting yesterday, and please enjoy the videos, and we'll move straight on from this one into Mark's presentation.
Hello, I'm Diane Smith-Gander, and it is my great pleasure to be with you today to launch the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists RESPFIT program. In my position as Chair of Safe Work Australia, I understand the importance of respiratory protective equipment, combined with other control measures, to protect workers' health and safety. Unfortunately, over the past 2 to 3 years, we have observed worrying trends of increasing cases of occupational lung diseases, including accelerated silicosis in engineered stone workers, as well as the resurgence of pneumoconiosis or black lung in coal workers. Occupational lung diseases are conditions of the respiratory system caused by workplace exposure to a range of hazardous chemicals and dusts. In addition to silicosis and coal workers' pneumoconiosis, occupational lung diseases include work-related asthma and asbestosis. The key industries in which workers are at risk of developing an occupational lung disease include construction, mining, quarrying, and those who work with engineered stone. Let's focus on silica and silicosis for a moment. Accelerated silicosis cases, once considered rare, have been increasing. Crystalline silica can be found in common construction materials such as concrete, tiles and engineered stone. When workers cut, drill, grind or polish these materials, they create silica dust. Inhaling silica dust can cause irreversible damage to the lungs. Symptoms of silicosis may not appear for many years after exposure. Workers may be diagnosed with these diseases and not present with any symptoms, even at the point of initial diagnosis, which is why prevention and health monitoring are critical. Safe Work Australia members are aware of the importance of addressing silicosis and other occupational lung diseases and have made them a priority condition under the Australian Work Health and Safety Strategy. They have also agreed to a comprehensive work plan, including 3 key initiatives that supplement the compliance and education activities being undertaken by work health and safety regulators in the Commonwealth, states and territories. These initiatives focus on education and awareness, including publishing a national guide for working with silica and silica-containing products. This guide has also been translated into 6 languages to assist our culturally and linguistically diverse community. Research, including the recently updated Occupational Lung Diseases in Australia report, and evidence gathering, including data investigation, collection and analysis. Recently, I had to replace an engineered stone bench in my kitchen. Amazingly, it developed a crack. To choose the new stone, I visited the company's workshop. I think they were not quite expecting my questions around their work practices, but I am delighted to say that they passed with flying colours and mentioned that they had received a site visit from their state regulators. Very encouraging. Now, the resurgence of some occupational lung diseases and subsequent increase in awareness of the risks have led to a welcome increase in the use of respiratory protective equipment in the workplace. Higher order control measures such as isolating workers, wet cutting and local exhaust ventilation are critical to minimising health and safety risks in the workplace. Respiratory protective equipment should also be part of the risk management approach. However, effectively using a respirator is not as simple as just putting it on. Correct fit testing is an essential step, which assures both the worker and the employer that the respirator fits properly and provides the intended protection. While respiratory protective equipment should be the last line of defence, it is critical that it works as intended to protect workers' health. As everyone's face is a different size and shape, there is no one size fits all. Each worker should pass a respirator fit test before they first start wearing a tight-fitting respirator and before they undertake any dusty work. A respiratory protective equipment fit test is a method for checking that a tight-fitting facepiece matches the person's facial features and seals adequately. It also identifies when a piece of equipment is not suitable for a worker. Fit testing is also essential in making sure that the respirator works correctly and is comfortable to wear, with any other personal protective equipment that may be used. I purchased a hat recently for weekend wear. The website gave me a great deal of information on the style of hat that might fit my face and the way to ensure a great fitting hat. The hat came with a filler to ensure a great fit. If that much attention can be given to ensuring a hat fits, I think we can all manage to pay some attention to fitting respirators. So today I am pleased to launch the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists RespFit program. The RespFit program aims to improve the protection of Australian workers through reliable testing by competent fit testers. The program will ensure that accredited respirator fit testers have the knowledge, skills and competency necessary to do the task properly. Fit testers will attend RespFit standardised training and undergo a thorough theoretical and practical examination process. I am pleased to note that the online nature of the examination process has been designed to enable fit testers throughout Australia to access this accreditation process. RespFit will also provide information and tools for workplaces to make informed decisions on respiratory protective equipment that is appropriate for their working environment, controls and their workers. Safe Work Australia shares the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists' commitment to worker health protection, and this program will ensure that respirators now fit properly, driving health risk reductions and minimising worker exposure. Safe Work Australia, along with work health and safety regulators, are making important and significant changes in the area of occupational lung diseases, including reducing the workplace exposure standard for respirable crystalline silica. This change, along with more stringent compliance activities, changes in workplace practices, and improving the choice and use of respiratory protective equipment are critical in managing health and safety risks in the workplace. RespFit is an excellent example of collaboration between the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists, industry, and work health and safety regulators. I'm looking forward to seeing the success of this program over the coming years and knowing that more workers are going to work with the right protection from the risks of developing occupational lung diseases. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Hi everyone, thank you for logging into this session. My name's Mark Reggers. I'm the chair of RespFit, and I'm going to be spending a short amount of time just going over about the RespFit respirator fit testing training and accreditation program, which we've been working on for the past 2 years. I really want to thank Diane Smith-Gander, who's officially launched RespFit, which is really exciting. It's been a long time to get this day, so really exciting and nervous that it's finally here. So for those that may not be aware of what RespFit is a respirator fit testing training and accreditation program, and it has the objective of improving worker health protection of all those workers that are wearing tight-fitting respirators wherever they may be. And we're going to be doing that through the provision of a standardised training syllabus that RespFit has developed, as well as an accreditation process for individuals to be able to demonstrate their competence when it comes to respirator fit testing. Another key objective for us is providing guidance to workplaces so they can make a more informed decision when it comes to respirator fit testing. We know there's a lot of information out there, and for a lot of them, they're coming across fit testing for the very first time and not sure where to start, where to begin, and that's going to be some of that guidance that we're looking to provide. So we started the process of RespFit, or what became RespFit, about 2 years ago, long before the pandemic and the current environment we're all very familiar with. As we know, we're starting to see the re-emergence of silicosis, black lung. We had 2019, 2020 bushfires at the start of the year. So there really is that demand from workplaces, workers to, enhance protection so they don't have to go to work or be in those environments and not be protected sufficiently. We know where respiratory protection sits in the hierarchy of control. It is that last line of defence, but that doesn't make it any less important than any one of the other controls. And ensuring that fit is there is ensuring that protection is going to be achieved reliably. Up until now, there kind of really hasn't been clear guidance in Australia with what constitutes a good fit test, or what are the competent person requirements. 1715, or Australian Standards 1715, provides guidance around the fit testing methodologies, but really doesn't have that level of detail that we would expect now. So where RespFit is looking to fill that gap and provide that guidance and improve the quality of respirator fit testing in Australian workplaces. Now, there's lots of different types of respirators that do require to be fit tested, and a lot of these are not going to be a surprise to most of you, but there are many workplaces that don't really appreciate or understand that, positive pressure respirators, tight-fitting positive pressure respirators absolutely need to be fit tested as well. So, trying to get that education out there to workplaces. There are a number of different respirator fit testing methodologies out there internationally. RespFit, we're really looking at the three main ones that are predominantly used in Australia today, being that qualitative aerosol taste test, quantitative ambient aerosol condensation nuclei counting, and the quantitative controlled negative pressure. There are other fit testing methodologies a few of you may be aware of internationally, but really going to be focusing in on those three main methods there with what gets covered in training courses and the accreditation process. As I said, many workplaces are coming across fit testing for the first time, so providing that guidance is a key aspect there. So this is an example of one of the graphics we have up on our website, just highlighting what types of respirators are suitable or not suitable for different types of styles of respirators. So if you're new to fit testing, this is all very overwhelming. So that's why we have this type of information available on our website. Now, I'm sure many of you have visited our website, which we launched a couple of months ago, which was really exciting at that time, respfit.org.au, where you'll find information like that, where we'll be listing, fit testers, training companies, a whole bunch of resources for workplaces, FAQs for fit testing. So really, it's that hub for all things respirator fit testing. No matter the brand, no matter the style, that information is going to be there to get that education, to have that approach. Now, we're trying to make this really simple for workplaces. If they have any of those tight-fitting respirators, positive or negative pressure, fit testing is going to be required. So the question is going to be, do I want to do it in-house? Do I have somebody internally that I would like to train up or would already be deemed competent? Or do I want to engage someone externally to be able to come in and provide those fit testing services for me? So if a workplace has a competent person, absolutely knock your socks off, go and conduct that fit testing through that process. Maybe a workplace doesn't have someone competent at the moment, but they would like to go down the path to start that journey. This is where the RespFit website will be listing those approved training providers so they can be contacted and be booked in, purchase the equipment that you're going to go down or going to use for them to go forward and start to conduct that respirator fit testing. But it starts with getting that right information right from the word go as you start to build that experience. We would then be recommending, if they're not already RespFit accredited, to undertake that accreditation process as evidence of that specific competency. If they don't want to conduct it in-house for the variety of reasons that may be in place there, that's where they can look to engage a fit tester. And all their details will be on the RespFit website once, we start to get through that accreditation process. So really want to try and keep that process as simple as possible. For companies that are saying, hey, you know what, I think I would like to investigate becoming a training provider. So we have plenty of information on our website, respfit.org.au, where we make that syllabus available. Training providers would then develop their course materials to the syllabus. They would submit it, as well as their trainer evidence, so there's specific requirements around trainers. That will get reviewed by a team of assessors. If there's any gaps that haven't quite hit the mark, certainly we will provide that feedback to be resubmitted, with the objective to get to the point where the course material and the trainers have been signed off to then be deemed an approved training provider. The details go on the website. It's a 3-year approval, and we'll be providing different type of badges to assist with the marketing materials as well. As far as those fit testers, and I'm sure many of you are saying, hey, I want to undertake this accreditation process. What does that involve? So there's a few different ways before leading up to the point of applying. Now, that may be undertaking an appropriate course, such as an approved RespFit course, going out, getting experience conducting fit testing, or maybe you've got experience because you've been doing fit testing for a number of years. It's not mandatory to attend an approved RespFit course, but certainly will be something we're recommending because the course does cover that information we will be looking for based off 1715 and the international fit testing standards such as ISO 16975-3. Stage 1 involves a 1-hour timed closed book exam. That's the one exam for all methodologies. Providing they pass that, that goes into a practical video assessment where applicants will submit a video of them conducting a fit test specific to the methodology they have nominated. If they don't pass the exam, certainly multiple attempts are allowed. Maybe a case of go out there and do some more fit testing, maybe a case of doing a bit more study, whatever it may be, we certainly can reattempt that exam. From that video, once again, our team of assessors will review that to get to the point to be deemed competent against the criteria. If you don't pass that, once again, multiple video attempts are allowed, but maybe a case of going out and gaining more fit testing experience. Through that process, once deemed competent at the time of assessment, then they will be, classified as a RESFIT accredited fit tester, and all their details will be on the website. Provided a badge, the details will be there as well. So for companies and individuals, that's going to be something you can add into your marketing materials. So we're all human organisations, so what's in it for me? So if you're an organisation, obviously there's going to be requirements with all things health and safety to demonstrate to the regulators that you're meeting certain standards. So when it comes to fit testing, you can demonstrate that the fit tester or the person conducting your fit testing is a competent person. Now, whether that's somebody in-house or whether that's somebody you've engaged externally to provide that. Obviously, from a RESFIT point of view, if you want to get that person trained up in-house, we provide that platform, those contact details of companies that have met the criteria, provide a reliable and great course there. Plus all the other information that we're providing on the website to help workplaces around all information when it comes to fit testing. If you're a fit tester and you want to become an accredited fit tester, having that opportunity or having that framework to demonstrate, to formally have your competence recognised, obviously, we're trying to promote fit testing as a professional undertaking. Just because you know how to use a machine or you understand or you've watched a YouTube video, that doesn't make you a competent fit tester. You know, there's a lot of things relying on that reliability of that fit test and listing your details on a website for those people looking for fit testers. And much like training companies, you can demonstrate that your course has met the set criteria. That is that framework that was set up based on international best practice and knowledge and standards there, and having your details on the website. So it's really exciting. Once again, thank you, Diane Smith-Gander, for officially launching RESFIT. We can't have a launch without fireworks, so there's some fireworks for everyone there. It's really exciting, but we wouldn't be able to get to this specific point in time. It's been 2 years of a lot of work from a lot of people, and I really just want to shout out to the people that have been involved along the way, the last two AIOH councils. Like I said, it's been a lot of work, and I hope as you go through the process and look what we've been able to put together, you do thank these people for their contribution in that specific way. Now, I've given a really short overview. 10 minutes is not a lot of time, and I'm sure there's a lot more details you really want to find out. So that's why we're running a virtual chapter meeting next week on the 9th of December to go over a lot more detail. So I really hope you do join us. Thank you for your time today. Hope you start to talk about RESFIT, but for further information, visit our website or shoot an email to resfit@aioh.org.au. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Mate, that's a super effort, Mark. Mate, you and the RESFIT committee have been getting a lot of love and well-deserved love in the chat. So a big virtual round of applause for everyone that's been involved with this. It's been a long time coming. Make sure you go up to the website and link to that and go and check that out, as Mark's just said. Look, the next session, I've been curious about this one. It's got a very intriguing title. That was then, and this is now. Things I never thought I would know about, but I should have. It's being presented by Andrea Herring, and she is the former head of the clinical operations support for CareFlight. So don't forget to use the chat and ask your questions, and I'm sure this would be a good chat for lots of feedback and other people dropping in what they would have liked to have known about. That's thank you, Andrea.
Well, hello, everybody. My name's Andrea Herring, and I'm the Head of Clinical Operations Support for CareFlight, which is an aeromedical retrieval organisation. I'd like to thank the AIOH for inviting me to give this short presentation today where I'm going to talk about mine and our organisation's experiences during COVID, particularly with our use of respiratory protection and a whole lot of items related to that. But firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today. And I pay my respect to all First Nations peoples and to elders past and present. So I'm going to go over the next few minutes giving you a snapshot of my experience, and hopefully by the end of this period of time you'll have an understanding of what we've all been through, certainly from this particular clinician's perspective. As a matter of my personal background, I've been a registered nurse for over 30 years and I've worked across the health system in New South Wales and in some operations nationally. And currently I work at CareFlight and we are aeromedical retrieval organisation. I'm just going to go through our platforms, the platforms that we work on, so that you can have an understanding of what that looks like for us. So we transport patients both within New South Wales and the Northern Territory primarily, and we also do aeromedical retrieval work when COVID is not in place around international operations across the South Pacific and often up into the Northern Hemisphere as well. We have jet operations and we transport critically ill and injured patients in those jets and usually in a doctor-nurse team. Now that critically for COVID, the airflow in the jets runs from back to front, so from the back of the aircraft towards where the aircrew and the pilots are particularly, so that has implications for our infectious disease risk. We have King Air turboprop aircraft, and they're primarily nurse-run services, and we take doctors on those when we have more severely ill or injured patients. And the airflow in the King Airs is front to back, so that's more advantageous for the pilots in that the airflow is running away from them. We also have helicopter operations, and they are nurse and doctor manned, and the airflows in the helicopters is free circulating, but we can control some of the airflows. But ideally, we'd like to look to isolate the front of the cabin from the rear of the cabin where the patients might be. And we also transport patients in road vehicles, patient transport vehicles we call them, and they are very similar to ambulances. They have full air conditioning systems where we can control the airflow, in particular whether the air is recirculated or not. But overall, it's confined space operations, and often we can be transporting very seriously ill and injured patients. So initially, like most of us, we thought maybe this is just a flu and we'll keep an eye on it. We took the opportunity to review our infection prevention and control procedures, and we certainly reviewed our droplet contact precautions and aerosol precautions for our teams working in these environments. As you're all aware, there was a very rapid progression of COVID and SARS-CoV-2 and identification of how it was transmitted. But even during those early phases, we were being bombarded with changing evidence on almost a day-to-day basis. We had a real issue with our masks, use of masks, and primarily we only had supply for surgical masks and a small supply of N95 or P2 respirator masks. We really, in health then, were only familiar with the disposable type masks and particularly only surgical masks. Rapidly, I became aware of all the different types of ratings for respirators, ranging through all the P's in the Australian standards and the N's and the P's and the R's in the US standards and the European standards and the 100s and the 200s and the 300s. And I must say that's a knowledge base that I never really thought I'd have at this stage in my career, but for all of us, it was a very rapid learning curve. We had lots of clinicians, particularly our medical staff, who work in the pre-hospital environment and are often exposed to patients when they're severely injured, where they have to perform aerosol generating procedures. So for them, they felt that they were particularly at risk for exposure to COVID. And they went and investigated the possibilities of using the reusable elastomeric respirators. For us in health, and particularly in my organisation, this was an entirely new area and we really hadn't considered it. Through that process, we became aware of the fact that there were a whole lot of Australian standards surrounding the use of respirators for respiratory protection that health and we particularly had not even been aware of before COVID. So through all of this, we had massive amounts of information, some of it valid, some of it not so valid, new evidence turning up almost daily about SARS-CoV-2, how it was spread, was there a risk or droplet or aerosol spread, and how do we protect our staff and effectively and safely manage our patients during the same period of time. Of course, we were all washing our hands. We had issues with procurement of our hand sanitizers. All of a sudden, we couldn't procure hand sanitizers. So even I was looking up on the net how to make hand sanitizer in case we just couldn't procure it all. We paid exorbitant prices, but we did manage to get supply. So along with that and the distancing and then the respiratory protection, my whole world and our whole world changed seemingly overnight. For us, our main issues were around how it was spread. What were the airflows in our aircraft and how do we protect our staff, not only our clinical staff, but our aviators as well, those who were responsible for flying us around. How do we sort out what was valid evidence and what was not so valid evidence? Who did we know who to trust in this environment? How do we kill this virus? I've learnt more about enveloped and non-enveloped viruses than I ever thought I would need to know. So we really had to move at a rapid pace, and perhaps for us the main issues were understanding the types of respiratory protection that we needed, understanding how we could procure, and then understanding the regulatory environment around that. So that was then, pre-COVID, and now in our COVID future world. Supply chains were a real issue for us. As you're all aware, the supply chains dried up, particularly when the US government redirected supplies to supply their health system, and our normally reliable supply chains were no longer existent. And then our governments also redirected supply so that they could secure for the public health system. And we deliver services for the public health system, so in the end I had to reach back out through to New South Wales Health and Health Share to procure supply when we were running very, very low. Understanding the classification systems and actually then understanding what was a fake N95 P2 mask and what was the real deal. Certainly learned a lot about markings and then a whole lot of fake supply which turned up in our alternate supply chains as well too. And we did spend some money securing masks which were in fact fakes. So that was very disappointing for us. Then we learned all about the national standards for respiratory protection, and really health has not been involved in that. The standards that were applicable to other industries outside of health, and on a personal level that was probably quite disappointing. We had a lot of conversations around fit checking and fit testing, and traditionally in health we had always fit checked our N95 P2 masks, but we didn't know that there was another world related to fit testing and quantitative and qualitative fit testing and what this actually meant for staff protection. In other parts of the world, other health systems were already involved in this sort of process, but for us in New South Wales and Australia, it's now obvious that we weren't, and we weren't really aware of it. So for some reason, we sat outside other industries when it came to respiratory protection programs. And the other main issue that we had particularly was where our staff had gone off and done a whole lot of research around the use of the reusable elastomeric respirators. We found that within the regulatory environment, there was lots of ambiguity in the language that was being used. Therapeutic Goods Group is responsible for regulating the use of medical devices in health, and there was greyness in determining whether reusable elastomeric respirators were in fact medical devices and then needed approval in the ARTG or not. And because in Australia these devices were not promoted as protection for healthcare workers, the view of the TGA was that they didn't need regulatory registration. However, the view of the health system was that if they were to be used as protection for healthcare workers, then they needed TGA approval before we were allowed to use them. So while we had conducted a fit testing program and our staff wanted to use them, we were in fact unable to because there was a disconnect between the regulatory environment and the system requirements for use. This actually did cause a lot of stress amongst our staff. So overall, hopefully I've been able to portray to you the environment that we've been living in the last 6 months. We certainly seem to have settled down now more to a bit of a COVID business as usual. We're still not using our elastomeric respirators as the regulatory hurdles we have to climb over within health are high, and we've now been able to source more of our disposable respiratory protection. We have in fact implemented a full respiratory protection program in CareFlight, both in New South Wales and the Northern Territory, and now we're starting to conduct our own fit testing for both our disposable and our reusable respirators. And hopefully this will lead to a much safer respiratory protection environment for our staff going forward. But certainly we had no idea that this world even existed prior to COVID happening. So I'd really like to take this opportunity to acknowledge Linda Apthorpe for her ongoing advice and counsel during all of this. It has been invaluable, and she has supplied lots of information, and without her informing me requirements for running a respiratory protection program, we wouldn't be where we are today. And I'd also like to acknowledge Katie Blair and On-Site Safety for really being able to come and provide fit testing for us at super short notice. So thank you very much.
I grew up about 30 kilometres outside of Melbourne in a small town on the Yarra River called Warrandyte. I guess you could describe our house as a bit of a hobby farm. We had all the things that seem to have become popular again in this pandemic. A vegetable garden, chickens, homemade bread. We even had a cow that I had to milk every day after school. It wasn't unusual for us in summer to walk or ride our bikes over to the Yarra River for a swim. Even then it was really hard to catch a fish. I guess I didn't know it at the time, but without a doubt those experiences have shaped my views on how we live and interact with our environment today. One day while I was at work, a guy called looking for some soil sampling equipment. He was planning to go to Africa to work with local farmers on soil conditions. After hearing his story, I was excited to get involved, and we ended up providing the equipment to him. As it turned out, he worked in Africa for around 6 months, and during this time, through educating the farmers, he was able to increase their crop yield each season. That was an enriching experience for me, and it occurred to me that every time we get an instrument or a piece of equipment into someone's hands, we enable them to do great work, whether that's making a workplace safe or monitoring our environment. This is our purpose, to make a difference, and we can make a difference by enabling people like you to do great work. So currently, while some of us are restricted in some things that we can do, we're still here anticipating your needs. And we understand that your needs are changing, and we're here for you. Whether that's to provide technical support or just to have a chat about what's new. Because for us, right now, enabling you to do great work is more important than ever.
AirMet Scientific is delighted to once again continue our long-standing support and partnership with the AIOH and the hygiene community. As one of our core missions is to bring together people and empowering them to make a difference, AirMet is also proud to announce our support of the RespFit fit testing and accreditation program, an important program to increase awareness of respirator fit testing and improve the competency of fit testers through education and training. And now I'd like to introduce the invited speakers, Jane Whitelaw, Discipline Lead, Occupational Hygiene from the University of Wollongong, and Kate Cole, Director of Cole Health, to begin their presentation. How to spot a fake. Is your respirator up to standard?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Cole, and today I'm joined with the fabulous Jane Whitelaw, and today we're going to take you through our presentation, How to Spot a Fake, Is Your Respirator Up to Standard? So today we're going to focus on P2 disposable respiratory protection. So just a quick recap of what we mean when we refer to this. Respiratory protection is a type of personal protective equipment that protects people from breathing in substances hazardous to their health. And respiratory protection needs to comply to certain standards to demonstrate protection. There are no relevant Australian standards for homemade masks, and while surgical masks should comply to Australian Standard 4381, they are not respiratory protection. So we're focusing on the ones that are shown on the right-hand side of the screen. But let's take everyone back to the start of the year. This was Sydney last summer. Feels like a lifetime ago, but this is the start of our story. Up until this point, if you went to go and buy a P2 disposable respirator, chances were it would have met the Australian standard. The terms fake mask, KN95, counterfeit respirators, or TGA certified just were not in our vocabulary back then. But earlier this year, that all changed due to the strong demand for P2 respirators caused by the health hazards of bushfire smoke across our country. A quick Google search for P2 masks would show up something like these examples. So we can start to see things like P2, N95. I'm just circling some of the things that I would find on my Google search or social media feed. And Jane and I had this thing going where we would try to divide and conquer. We'd each contact certain companies and explain their error. And typically, if they're Australian companies, they would change the way their products were advertised. So here's some before and after shots of different products where they originally advertised it as a P2, an N95 or a PM 2.5 mask, whatever that is. And then they changed the advertising afterwards after we contacted them. It was a bit like whack-a-mole, but we were getting through these companies fairly well. Then one day, I was walking to my office in Sydney and I saw a billboard for these in big writing being advertised as a P2 mask. This was getting out of hand. Now it's more than just social media, because people were going to billboards. So I decided to post about it on a Facebook group where I knew that reporters frequented, with the idea of getting some media coverage to help deal with this issue at a larger scale. This is me in February as part of a story on that product, and then afterwards the company removed them from sale. They were actually quite good about it. And then COVID-19 hit and things got a little bit crazy. Instead of dealing with one or two non-compliant products every couple of weeks, the amount of non-compliant products being sold across Australia just skyrocketed. But this time, it wasn't just being advertised on social media or billboards. These products were being directly marketed to construction sites and other places where suppliers knew that P2 respirators were needed. And in the majority of cases, the supplier would say things like, it's a TGA certified product, as some way to attempt to explain to us that these products were somehow approved. So Jane and I started by establishing a Facebook group and sharing our findings. We helped others who were being inundated with non-compliant products. This group quickly grew to over 150 members, noting that we had hundreds of more requests to join, but they tended to be from suppliers trying to look for somewhere to promote their product, so they were quickly rejected. But how did we know that these products were non-compliant? What did we do about it, and how effective were we? What can you do also to spot a non-approved P2? Well, this is the real start to our story. I'll hand over to Jane.
Well, let's start at the beginning with a quick review of the standards for respirators. There are many international standards for respiratory protection, but as we're in Australia and have a great standard in ASNZS 1716, Our preference should always be for a P2 respirator. We understand that during a pandemic, supplies can be restricted, so we also currently accept the use of NICE-approved N95s. There are other standards such as those that refer to FFP2s and KN95s, but it is important to understand that these standards are not identical in nature. While they're similar, there are some real key differences between the tests that the products need to meet for it to be approved. So if a P2 is the go-to in Australia, what do you do? Well, if a P2 is available, then verify it meets the requirements of AS/NZS 1716, which is not so easy, but more on that later. If a P2 is not available, consider using a NICE-approved N95 or EN-approved FFP2. Best to do your homework, though, before placing that order. If a product is a P2, it will have certain product markings. It will have passed laboratory tests around filtration efficiency, harness design and rough use, and importantly, a measure of total inward leakage on a panel of real people. This is all clearly outlined in our standard, and it's important that all tests are done and the product is correctly labelled. Here's a list of performance tests and criteria required under AS/NZS 1716, and you can look that up in the standard. Unlike other countries, we don't have a federal register of products that have been verified to meet this standard. However, there are certification bodies such as SAI Global, CertMark, BSI, Global Mark, that manufacturers can apply to and have their product verified as meeting the standard. And if the product is listed there, tick, that's great, that's really easy. But most new products aren't certified and there's no requirement for this. It's actually costly and time consuming. So what do? You need to check the actual lab tests for results against all the requirements of the standard. This takes time. The reports are often incomplete, misleading, or simply counterfeit. Kate and I spent many nights trolling through these reports and phoning each other to try and work them out. So NICE approval has a similar test and labelling requirements to AS/NZS 1716, and it also gives a unique approval number starting with TC. You can see that there on the respirator on the right-hand side. You need to be aware that fit testing is not part of their approval process. So a respirator could pass all other tests and then not fit many people. Confirmation of NICE approval is a bit easier, as the CDC have a register of approved products. Just look up the product alphabetically to check it has been evaluated and approved. They also call out counterfeits regularly, so it's a good place to look, as products may be dumped on our market if they're rejected by the USA. Sometimes you'll see a manufacturer claim FDA approval, but what does that mean? The FDA logo is for the official use of the US Food and Drug Administration, and not for use on private sector marketing materials. Any claim that a respirator is FDA approved or a face mask FDA approved is false. It also means it's likely a fake, although, as we said, it's pretty easy to tell if an N95 is approved by looking it up on the CDC website. So what about an FFP2 respirator? That's a European standard. Similar to our marking requirements, you need the name, the logo, European standard number, the class, and this European certification mark. You'll see that coming up in the next slide. The notified body responsible for certification, in this case, has got CE 0086. So there's that CE mark up the top. We saw a flood of products claiming EN compliance and carrying this CE mark. Lots of you contacted us to try and work through these, but at the end of the day, most were fakes. And how did we know? Most products didn't have the necessary markings under EN 149, but it was also confusing as several non-compliant products contained the markings that on face value appeared to meet the standard. We also checked the NANDO website and found the notified body wasn't authorised, and then we verified that they had the correct CE mark. Some respirators had a CE mark, meaning China export, not an EU declaration of conformity. So how do you tell if it's an FFP2 respirator? The product should have been tested by a laboratory that's accredited to perform the testing to the EN 149 standard. Here are some examples of certificates from non-accredited labs. So if you received one of these, the respirators were likely fake. We had a number of you contact us with those certificates. Should you use KN95 respirators? This is a Chinese-based standard, and the vast majority of non-compliant respirators we've seen are those marketed as KN95, claiming that they're equivalent to or better than P2 respirators. So whilst GB 2626 is similar to the Australian standard, the issue lies with the products not actually meeting the standard. Compliance with GB 2626 is achieved by passing the required performance tests and marking on products. There's no assessment of the existing or ongoing quality management system though, and there can be large discrepancies between batches of these masks or respirators. China doesn't maintain a list of products that are certified as KN95 either. The HSE UK, CDC and SafeWork New South Wales were also really proactive in calling out fraudulent products on masks claiming to meet KN95 standards. Poor design elements such as ear loops have been shown to affect the mask stability and face fit, and research by University of Montreal concluded that the KN95s they tested were highly variable, didn't meet standards of nose penetrating particle size, insufficient marking, so on and so forth. For these reasons, we don't recommend the purchase of KN95s. But you might ask, are there real KN95s? Yes, we haven't actually seen one in our Australian market in all the hundreds of respirators we have seen, or face masks. But here's a photo of one distributed in Asia, and it's pretty easy to see the clear product markings and the different quality of that respirator. So how do we know that's a real KN95 respirator? We can check the conformity assessment, comes from a CNAS accredited laboratory, matches the test report. Lots don't, lots of false reports out there, and we can cross-check the certificate with the issuing authority. So, in summary, a P2 should be our first choice, then an N95 or FFP2. Pictured are some websites such as the CDC, Canadian OHS and the European Safety Federation that make it easy to find products that comply to standards. But do you notice a big gap? There's nothing for Australia. Back to you, Kate.
Thanks, Jane. So by May, COVID was in full swing. Most of us were working from home and our healthcare workers were in the thick of it. We were being inundated by healthcare workers contacting us concerned about the respiratory protection that they were being provided, and rightly so. So in healthcare, there's one more additional step that you have to do to ensure that your product can be used in hospitals. You need to check that the product has TGA approval and then it's listed on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, or the ARTG. So you can do this by searching the register, which is a fairly simple process. But you need to know that there were more products listed on the ARTG in April and May this year than there were in the preceding 2 years. There was a massive influx of new products being registered. But just because the product is listed on the ARTG doesn't mean that it necessarily meets the Australian standard, or any standard for that matter. It's just one more additional step. So when suppliers were telling us that their product was TGA certified, which, side note, isn't actually what the TGA do, it was a massive red flag for us. So this was what was also happening in our hospitals, where good-meaning purchasers thought that just looking for TGA approval was enough. But we found that many of the products being marketed or sold as TGA approved, in fact, did not meet any standard for respiratory protection, and they were actually being provided in hospitals. We investigated the products, and then I pitched the story to Fairfax Media. And then on the 26th of May, we got front page media coverage in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age with our story, counterfeit face masks sold to Australian hospitals. And very glad to see the fabulous Jane Whitelaw being featured in front page media. The best thing about this story was that this was published in the morning, and by that evening, our Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt, ordered a probe into the use of counterfeit masks in hospitals, essentially instigating a national post-market review to counterfeit products or non-approved products on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, which is a fantastic outcome. By the end of May, 58 products were cancelled from the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, and that's when we really stepped it up. We submitted complaint after complaint to the TGA on non-compliant products, and now we're up to more than 570, mainly face masks, surgical masks and N95 respirators being removed from the ARTG. So we were being swamped with inquiries, and we wanted to stop giving people fish and rather teach them how to fish for themselves. So both Jane and I authored a guide to buying P2 respiratory protection to help people who are in purchasing departments, which will also help you. It goes through everything we've discussed with hyperlinks to original sources. That guide was recently updated to version 2 with more information, and it's now up and freely available on the RespFit website. The guide was a fantastic collaboration with the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists, together with the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, the New Zealand Occupational Hygiene Society, the Indoor Air Quality Association of Australia, and it was strongly supported by the ACTU and many state and international regulators and bodies. And when collaboration happens at this scale, it gives you an idea of just how many other people support this position and how we can be part of large-scale change. But while this is good news, you need to know that the source of the problem still remains. Over to you, Jane.
The missing link is a national register. Unfortunately, without this, everything you buy right now really is buyer beware. We need a national register urgently. The key message with all of this is that our national health and safety systems have a huge gap in them when it comes to purchasing respiratory protection and any other PPE for that matter. We're advocating loudly for the urgent establishment of a national register for respiratory protection, and you can be part of the solution by speaking up on the issue via your industry groups and also on social media. Thank you. Kate's going to wrap it up for us.
Well, I think in closing, both Jane and I would like to say a very big thank you to the many AIOH members who have helped us this year on our quest to bring down the fake mask. Whether it was hygienists, safety suppliers, safety professionals, regulators, we have had so much support. A special thanks goes to the AIOH Council and the many members who also went to or were quoted in the media, which is actually really hard. But if this year has taught us anything, it's the power of our collective voices and the importance of proactive media engagement to enable swift and meaningful positive change to enable safer workplaces across Australia. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow, how good are these two? Look, through Kate and through Jane this year, occupational hygiene has reached out into many new areas that we've not really had a lot of contact with before. And I know others have been involved as well, but these two have been particularly extremely active. I bet the TGA didn't really know what hit them, to be honest. I can't say enough. If you're not following Kate and Jane on the socials, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, you're missing out on that networking and that information share that's going on, and what occupational hygienists are really good at. Miss Jane here helps to keep me on the straight and narrow in hygiene, and feels like I'm at uni sometimes with her. She's correcting my Twitter comments, but these guys have done an amazing job this year. There's been a lot of comments in the chat line. I've got a couple of questions for you guys, and I guess the most popular question that's come up has come from Dino, He's asked whether you guys have tried to influence pharmacies, and this pharmacies seem to be a pretty trusted source of information.
I can answer that one. So yes, they are a trusted source of information, but they're also incredibly independent from each other. And the purchasing decisions tend to come from the pharmacist or someone that works at the pharmacy rather than an integrated or a network approach. So it is still a little bit like whack-a-mole. Only 5 weeks ago, I was walking down my local street to my favourite pharmacy only to see them selling masks that were pitched as better than N95, and my heart sank. So I had a really good conversation with the pharmacist, who was actually really brilliant once we provided the information and the guide, and quickly removed them from sale and replaced it with a compliant product. But it's just, I guess it just highlights how important those individual conversations are that we all need to have, but also how we also have to have those collective conversations at that high national level to make sure that this issue remains front of mind all of the time.
Yeah,
I'm going to use my... sorry, go ahead, Jane.
That's okay. We also did some work with a national hardware company that has outlets in nearly every city across Australia, and spoke to the purchasing manager for that chain and provided them with our P2 purchasing guide. So we gave them a resource so that they could check the products that they were selling. I think, unfortunately, it's just so much muddy water, and we got a lot of pushback from those companies and also from several national pharmacy groups. And we did speak to people at the highest level. We were then targeted by some suppliers who claimed that their products were compliant. So the issue really is to, bring it back to have a central register so that it's a one-stop shop. You go there, it's got all the checks and balances, and without that, we just can't be sure that what's out there actually meets the standard that it claims to meet. Yeah.
Where's that register at the moment, do you know?
There isn't one. We haven't had a central approval or government approval authority since 2000 in Australia. We have been campaigning for that, and would be very happy for others to join in, certainly.
So on that note, what can others do to help you with this process?
Well, I think from my perspective, what others can do is really harness our collective voices. So if 2020's taught us anything, and social media gets a lot of flack, but it's really the power of social media. So there's no way that we would have had the impact and the positive improvement in the healthcare space if it wasn't for Jane and I being on Facebook and Twitter and answering comments and offering support to other healthcare workers and other health and safety professionals in that industry to offer advice and direction and resources, and especially the guide to help them along the way. So it really is about speaking up. And I appreciate that that's really difficult sometimes, especially with the media. But if the media does contact you and you're an occupational hygienist, please consider saying, yes, I would love to provide a comment, and this is my professional opinion. That would be so incredibly helpful. I think we're a bit shy as hygienists at doing that, but that's been a really big lesson learned for us. So I think the power of collective voices, getting out there on social media, any professional event that you go to that speaks about respiratory protection, raise it as an issue. Unfortunately, until we get, increased media attention at a national level, like we did to instigate the post-market review of face masks from Minister Hunt, this issue will continue to just be in the background. So it really does need to, have us all there to give it the collective weight to get where it needs to be.
So look, we're a little bit short on time, so I'll get one more question for you here, and I think this one's really, really quite relevant, and probably more so for Christy. Christy Thornton's asked the question, what are your thoughts on healthcare workers reusing disposable P2 masks due to the lack of availability? Obviously a big issue in the States at the moment, more so than here.
Yeah, I'm happy to field that one. Great question, Christy. We've been following your adventures on social media. You look like you're having a ball over there. I would defer to the advice of the manufacturers. There are a number of studies that have been done about treatment, decontamination and reuse of respirators. At the present moment, I haven't seen anything that would make me confident that the integrity of a single-use respirator wasn't compromised through a decon and to be able to reuse it. And the manufacturers are got the latest up-to-date information on that, and CDC has a section on that that's updated regularly on their website.
Look, we're going to have to cut it short there. There's still a few extra questions in there, but like I said, there's been a lot of comments, and we'll share those with you guys shortly after this, and make sure that you can answer those where you can. So again, a big thank you to you guys for your participation. Hopefully we can catch up soon now that borders are down. We'll talk soon.
Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pete.
So I thought we were going to another video there, but we might just hang around for a couple more seconds until Tim's got it ready.
Probably community. When I think about the AIOH, I remember attending chapter meetings and conferences in person, catching up with friends, talking to familiar faces, sharing stories and ideas. There hasn't been a lot of that this year, but I'm hopeful next year I can share a story or toast a glass in person.
I just think of the amazingly supportive network of people and the fact that the greatest knowledge and the greatest minds are literally one phone call away.
I think the outstanding word is professional.
I guess two, friendship and networking is passion.
A few words come to mind actually. Support, networking, but most of all, passion.
So you're all back. Thank you very much to everyone for your participation today. What a fantastic day it's been. Hopefully you've been able to find a sneak out a couple of toilet breaks and update your snacks. It's been really great to see all the activity, participation online. So we've had a couple of comments that have been very hilarious. Mark Solomon, you are just a crazy man. Unfortunately, we can't give you 2 wins in a row. So the name for the person winning the free registration to the AIOH Masterclass in 21 is both Lee Sherry for her comment today on the quiz. When she was asked what the theme for the Perth conference was in 1990, she answered, "I was in pre-primary school, guys, but it was the standards in the 90s, real or imaginary." So she got that correct and won that award. And the funniest comment for the day, the one that made most of the community laugh, was Luke Denny's comment on Will's presentation around chromium 6, hexavalent chromium. "Hi, Will, I use Google Chrome. Should I be concerned?" And I think Will's answer was at the time, just check the upgrades or something like that. So apologies for that. But Luke Denny's, winner of the funniest comment of the day. So congratulations to you both. That's a wrap for today. I hope you'd agree that while a virtual catch-up isn't everything for everybody, it's difficult. It's been highlighting a couple of strengths of the online platform, and as you just heard from Kate and Jane, the strength of the media and strength of social media can actually give some unexpected results, and we're starting to see that. We're getting a wide audience, we're getting a lot of participation suggestions and potential solutions to people when they're raising an issue. Quite high level sort of responses and feedback. So it's instant and it's quick, so it's been really good. So we really look forward to your further participation tomorrow. So block out your calendar, turn your phone on to silent, get a comfortable seat, and we'll see you the same time in virtual place tomorrow. Thanks again for joining us today.